Alright, hello fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax and prepare to drift, not into sleep exactly, but into time itself. This is Sleepless Homo, where science slows down and history is told softly, for the thinkers who can't quite turn their minds off. Here we wander through fossils, forgotten worlds, and quiet questions about what it means to be human. Now imagine standing on the edge of what would one day be England, but isn't yet an island. The sea is farther away, the air sharper, colder, and heavy with salt from the vast estuaries that once drained across what we now call the North Sea. The ground beneath your feet isn't modern soil, but an ancient river delta. Mud, gravel and sand shaped by currents flowing north through a continent we can barely imagine. There are no cities, no borders, not even a Britain. Only a continuous stretch of land linking this place to what will one day be France and Germany. And yet, 1,000,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened here. A family of early humans, creatures not quite like us, but not entirely unlike, walked across this muddy plain. Their footprints, pressed into the silt of a vanished riverbank, would survive the collapse of continents, the crushing of glaciers, and the rise of the seas. They would wait, silently, for a species that did not yet exist to find them. When these footprints were discovered at Happisburgh in Norfolk, scientists could hardly believe it. The layers of earth that held them were ancient beyond expectation, close to 1,000,000 years old, dating to a time when England wasn't even an island. For generations, archaeologists had believed human history here began around half that age, with the warmer interglacials long after the Anglian ice had retreated. Yet these tracks, small, fragile, perfectly spaced like those of a family walking together, pushed the clock of British humanity back hundreds of thousands of years. Whoever made them wasn't Homo sapiens or Neanderthal or any species we can point to with certainty. They may have been Homo antecessor, an early human known from Spain, or a yet unknown relative. All we can say is that they walked here when Britain was still connected to Europe by a wild, river-laced tundra. The story of these first people is the story of a shifting world. At that time, the climate swung like a pendulum between cold and warmth. Britain lay at the edge of these swings, sometimes frozen under advancing ice, sometimes blooming with grasslands and rivers. Around 1,000,000 years ago it was in one of its warmer moods. Herds of straight-tusked elephants, hippos and giant deer wandered across open plains. The Thames, still young, ran not through London but much farther north, its path redirected again and again by the slow breathing of glaciers. To these early humans the land would have felt endless, rich with water and game. At nearby Pakefield, on the Suffolk coast, another clue emerged. Simple stone flakes, crude but unmistakably shaped by human hands, were found in sediments just as ancient as the Happisburgh prints. The tools are what archaeologists call Older One or Mode 1 technology, the simplest kind of stoneworking. Pebbles struck to make a single sharp edge, suitable for slicing meat or scraping hide. In the right light, they still hold that faint glimmer of intention, the moment a mind saw a shape inside a stone and decided to release it. That small leap of cognition, the ability to imagine a tool before it exists, is the thread that binds us to these early wanderers. But who were they truly? Their bones are gone. Not a single fossil of their kind has yet been found in Britain. All we have are traces, a footprint, a flake of flint, a cut-marked bone from a deer, its marrow split open by a blow from a stone hammer. From these fragments, scientists reconstruct a life lived on the edge of survival and curiosity. They were not farmers or builders, but opportunists, moving with the seasons, following herds and rivers. They carried no fire, at least none that has survived in the record, and they likely sought shelter in river valleys or under low cliffs where warmth and water met. the world they knew was unstable. Climate models suggest that in a few short millennia the warmth would fade, the grasses would brown, and ice would begin to crawl south again. Each time the ice advanced, it would erase much of the evidence of their existence, scouring the land clean. Perhaps that is why we find so little. They lived in a world constantly being rewritten by nature itself. It's strange to think that the earliest humans to set foot here could not have known they were exploring a frontier. To them, there were no islands or continents, just a vast terrain of opportunity stretching into haze. Yet geography was already shaping destiny. Britain's position on the edge of Europe meant it was always the first to freeze and the last to thaw. This edge, this shifting border between ice and green, would determine who could live here and when. At 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿, the prints tell us something else remarkable. There were children among them. Some impressions are smaller, lighter, perhaps a child walking beside an adult. The image is intimate. A family crossing a mudflat at low tide, maybe following a riverbank in search of food. One step after another, unaware that each movement pressed into the future. These were not aimless wanderers. They knew their world intimately. They had to. Survival meant noticing every change in wind, every new scent of water or decay. To live in such a place demanded attention of a kind most of us have forgotten, and yet we shouldn't romanticize them. Life for these early humans was not a noble adventure. It was dangerous, brief, and cold. Britain was home to predators, lions, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and massive herbivores that could trample or gore with ease. A carcass meant life, but it also meant competition. Scientists think these early humans were often scavengers, using their tools to crack open the bones left behind by other hunters. Their greatest advantage was not strength or speed, but persistence. They could walk farther and longer than almost any other animal. Persistence hunting, the ability to track prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, was one of humanity's oldest weapons. On these plains, that endurance would have been tested against every element the Ice Age could summon. Every discovery from this time comes with uncertainty. Radiometric dating, pollen analysis, magnetism, all must work together to estimate when a footprint was made or a tool was dropped. Even then, interpretations shift. Were these people permanent residents or seasonal visitors? Did they come north during warm summers and retreat south as winter closed in? The evidence leans toward the latter. They were part of a larger European population, following herds and rivers across open terrain, venturing north when the climate allowed, and vanishing again when it turned hostile. In this way, Britain was never truly empty, just waiting between breaths of climate. Geologists studying the sediments of East Anglia can still see those breaths. Layers of clay, sand and gravel mark ancient riverbeds. Each band tells a story of advance and retreat. Embedded within them are the fossils of ancient mammals, mammoths, rhinoceroses, even beavers, that reveal what kind of world these humans knew. The pollen trapped alongside those fossils shows shifting forests, birch and pine giving way to grassland and back again, a cycle repeated for hundreds of thousands of years. Humanity's presence is a mere whisper against this geological rhythm, yet a persistent one. Every return of warmth seems to call us back. To imagine these people is to stretch empathy across a gulf of time. They did not speak as we do, but they almost certainly communicated through gestures, through shared work, perhaps through sound. Cooperation was already a matter of survival. At Boxgrove in Sussex, evidence from a slightly later period shows how early humans worked together to butcher large animals. Though the 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐿 people lived long before that, they likely shared this instinct for coordination. It is one of our oldest traits, the ability to plan, to divide labour, to act together toward a goal. but there is something haunting in how temporary it all was. Within tens of thousands of years, a blink in evolutionary time, the ice would advance again, covering the land in glaciers hundreds of meters thick. The rivers would freeze, the forests die, and whatever families had once walked here would be driven out or perish. Britain would fall silent again, its human story interrupted by cold. When the ice finally retreated, the rivers would change course once more, and the traces of those first visitors would be buried under layers of silt. For 500,000 years, no one would know they had ever been here. Even today, our understanding of this period is incomplete, fragile as the footprints themselves. The North Sea hides much of what we wish to know. Doggerland, that lost bridge of plains and rivers, now drowned beneath sand and tide. Future discoveries may rewrite everything again, just as Happisburgh did. Each find humbles us, reminding us that the story of humanity in Britain is older, stranger, and more complicated than we imagined. When I think of those first people, I don't see them as ancestors exactly, but as witnesses, creatures who saw the same sun rise over the same horizon and left behind a trace of their passing. They did not build monuments, yet their memory survived longer than any stone. Each footprint is a message from a world without writing, a reminder that humanity's story has always been larger than our own species. And so, when you stand by the edge of the modern North Sea and look out toward that grey horizon, you are standing on the roof of an ancient world. Beneath the waves lies a forgotten landscape, crossed once by barefoot families walking through mud that would harden into time. Their steps are still there if you know where to look. We may never know their names or what they called themselves, but we know this much: they were here. And for a moment, long before England had a name, so were we. If you enjoy calm, fact-driven storytelling, the kind that trades drama for depth, you can gently tap like or subscribe. It helps other sleepless minds find their way back to wonder. Tell me in the comments, where do you listen from? In bed? On long drives? While working, cooking, or somewhere between dreaming and data? And if you drift off mid-story, don't worry. There are timestamps waiting when you return. This is slow science for tired humans. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine this. You are standing on a chalk cliff above a shallow bay in what will one day be southern England. The air smells of salt and damp grass, and the cries of gulls echo across an open landscape that stretches all the way to France. Below, a herd of enormous horses is grazing along the edge of a lagoon, their reflections trembling in the water. Farther inland, giant deer and ancient rhinoceroses roam among patches of woodland. This is not the Britain we know. It is a warm interglacial world, nearly 800,000 years before our time, when the sea was far away and the island was still part of the European mainland. The people who watched these animals were not like us, but they were not entirely unlike either. Archaeologists know them from one extraordinary place, Boxgrove in West Sussex. For more than 500,000 years, Boxgrove lay undisturbed beneath layers of chalk and gravel until the 1990s, when excavations uncovered a scene frozen in time. It was here that scientists found the remains of what is still one of the oldest known humans in Britain, a shin bone, powerful and thick, belonging to a tall, muscular hunter. Nearby they found teeth from another individual and thousands of perfectly made stone tools scattered across what was once a hunting ground. From these traces, a picture emerges of a species we call 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐴, a robust ancestor who lived long before both Neanderthals and modern humans, but who already showed flashes of the intelligence and cooperation that would define our lineage. 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐴 appeared in Europe around 800,000 years ago and is thought to have evolved from earlier African populations of Homo erectus. They were large-bodied, standing nearly as tall as us but heavier, built for endurance and strength. Their faces were broader, their brows more pronounced, their skulls thicker, and their brains smaller, but still remarkably complex for their time. The people of Boxgrove lived at the edge of an English coastline that has since vanished, a world of open steppe, low forest and tidal flats rich in animal life. The climate was warm enough for hippos and elephants, yet cool enough for grazing herds that provided food in abundance. For them, this land was a perfect hunting ground. The tools they left behind were not crude. Archaeologists found hundreds of hand axes at Boxgrove, carved from flint with a skill that suggests both teaching and repetition. Each piece fits the hand perfectly, balanced and sharp along its edges. These were not random stones picked up in haste, but carefully crafted instruments designed for cutting meat, scraping hides, and shaping wood. The act of making them required planning, an ability to imagine a final form before striking the first blow. That kind of thinking hints at something profound: foresight, coordination, maybe even pride in the craft itself. Many of these hand axes were so finely made that some researchers suspect they were as much symbols of skill as tools of survival. But the Boxgrove people were not mere artisans. They were hunters, or at least very skilled scavengers who could stand their ground among predators. The bones of horses found at the site show cut marks along their limbs, where muscles were sliced away, and percussion scars on the joints where marrow was extracted. One remarkable find even preserved the faint impressions of butchery tools still embedded in sediment, as if the work had happened only yesterday. From these clues, we can reconstruct a moment: a small group of humans standing over a freshly killed horse, working quickly to harvest its meat before scavengers arrived. Perhaps they had brought it down themselves, using teamwork to corner it against the soft banks of a lake. Or perhaps they had chased off hyenas to claim the remains. Either way, it was a coordinated effort, the kind of collective action that required communication and trust. But the Boxgrove people were not mere artisans. They were hunters, or at least very skilled scavengers who could stand their ground among predators. The bones of horses found at the site show cut marks along their limbs, where muscles were sliced away, and percussion scars on the joints where marrow was extracted. One remarkable find even preserved the faint impressions of butchery tools still embedded in sediment, as if the work had happened only yesterday. From these clues, we can reconstruct a moment: a small group of humans standing over a freshly killed horse, working quickly to harvest its meat before scavengers arrived. Perhaps they had brought it down themselves, using teamwork to corner it against the soft banks of a lake. Or perhaps they had chased off hyenas to claim the remains. Either way, it was a coordinated effort, the kind of collective action that required communication and trust. Archaeologists studying the layers of sediment at Boxgrove have even found evidence of how these people lived day to day. The flint they used was collected from local sources, indicating they knew their environment intimately. They understood which cliffs yielded the best stone, how to strike it, and where to find water and shelter. This knowledge was likely shared across generations, an oral map of survival long before words or writing. They may have followed the migrations of animals, returning seasonally to Boxgrove when herds passed through. Each visit left behind a thin archaeological fingerprint, a scatter of tools, bones, and footprints hardened into mud that would one day become history. The remains of animals found at Boxgrove also tell us about their diet. Alongside horses and deer were bones of rhinoceroses, bison, and even smaller mammals. Some were hunted, others scavenged, but nearly all show signs of human processing. Marrow extraction was especially important, offering fat and calories that could sustain a group through leaner times. Breaking open the heavy bones of a large prey required strength and precision, an operation that probably involved multiple people working in sequence. You can almost hear the rhythm. Stone against bone, a crack, a pause, another strike. When the bones split, they would scrape out the warm marrow with flakes of flint and share it among themselves. It wasn't just food, it was community. And then there is that single shin bone, the Boxgrove man himself. His fossil tells us more than any tool. The bone shows a powerful frame, dense muscle attachments, and a healed injury on the left side, perhaps from a fall or a heavy blow. He survived it, which implies that others cared for him while he healed. Compassion, or at least practical cooperation, was already part of their behaviour. He would have lived in small bands, maybe a few dozen individuals bound by kinship and need. They communicated not through structured language as we know it, but through gesture, rhythm, and shared experience. Every movement had meaning. Every silence had weight. For a long time, scientists debated whether the people of Boxgrove hunted large animals actively or scavenged kills left by predators. Today, the answer seems to lie somewhere in between. The evidence suggests they were opportunists, capable of both driving prey into traps and seizing the moment when nature offered a meal. They used their intelligence to read the landscape, knowing when rivers flooded, when herds gathered, when carcasses would wash up along the tide. This flexibility, this capacity to adapt without specialization, may be why our lineage survived when others vanished. What makes Boxgrove so unique is not just its age, but its clarity. Most early human sites are fragmentary, a few bones here, a flint there. But at Boxgrove, entire surfaces were preserved, as if the moment of life had been sealed in sediment. Archaeologists can see where tools were made, where animals were butchered, even where individuals knelt or sat. One area preserved a group working together, their tools clustered around the remains of a horse. Another revealed debris from flint knapping, the waste flakes forming a halo around the spot where someone once shaped a hand axe. Each scatter of stone is a small act of biography. Still, there is so much we do not know. We have no trace of their voices, their laughter, their fears. We can only infer from the evidence left behind. Did they paint their bodies with ochre? Did they adorn themselves with bone or feather? We have no signs of that yet. Their world appears purely practical, a place where survival required skill rather than symbol. But even in practicality there is beauty, in the precision of a flake struck cleanly, in the silent choreography of hunters at dusk. The very fact that we can recognize their intentions, separated by nearly 500,000 years, means their minds were already reaching towards something recognizably human. Eventually, this golden period of warmth faded. Climate records show that within a few tens of thousands of years, the ice began its long advance once more. Forests withered, rivers froze, and the great animals moved south. So too did the humans. Britain would be abandoned again, left to the cold. When people returned, they would be different, still human, but of a new kind. Yet Boxgrove remained beneath the chalk, a memory waiting to be rediscovered. When I think about them, these hunters of Boxgrove, I can't help but feel a sense of continuity. They never knew that their bones and tools would outlast their names, that someday other humans would hold them and try to understand. Their world was raw and immediate, defined by muscle, hunger, and patience. And yet, in the shape of their tools and the healing of a wound, we glimpse the earliest shadow of ourselves. We like to believe that civilization began with writing or art, but perhaps it began here, in the simple act of standing side by side, striking flint, and sharing the marrow of the earth. Imagine this. A land that once breathed with warmth, grass and rivers now lies buried under a wall of ice. The horizon is gone. The sky is a low ceiling of cloud and wind. the air itself burns with cold. Beneath that frozen weight, the bones of elephants, rhinoceroses, and ancient humans lie crushed and scattered, remnants of a world erased not by war or fire but by temperature. Around 450,000 years ago, the island that would one day be called Britain ceased to exist as anything alive might have recognised it. The climate turned suddenly and completely, and for the next tens of thousands of years, this land became an uninhabitable desert of ice. This was the Anglian glaciation, one of the most extreme cold phases of the Pleistocene epoch. It didn't happen overnight, but in geological terms it was abrupt, a shift from mild interglacial forests and floodplains to a continent locked in permafrost. Britain, still connected to the rest of Europe, became the northernmost edge of a frozen world that stretched from the Atlantic to the Urals. Scientists reconstruct this ancient catastrophe not from legend or text, but from layers of gravel, pollen and clay that still whisper the story beneath our feet. Before the freeze, rivers flowed freely across southern England. The Thames, still young, ran on a different course entirely, cutting through what is now East Anglia and joining with the Bitham River, a vast prehistoric waterway that wound across the Midlands. Herds of horses and deer grazed along its banks, followed by humans like those of Boxgrove. But as the climate began to shift, rainfall changed, vegetation died back, and permafrost spread southward. The first signs of the coming catastrophe appeared as subtle things: the disappearance of temperate tree pollen in the record, the growth of tundra plants, and the sudden appearance of drop stones, rocks carried and released by glaciers into what had once been warm sediments. As temperatures plummeted, ice sheets began to advance from the north. The Scandinavian and Scottish ice masses expanded until they met over what is now the North Sea basin, forming a continuous field of ice hundreds of metres thick. In some places it was over a kilometre deep, heavy enough to crush entire valleys. This ice didn't move gently. It scraped, dragged, and pulverised everything in its path. It carved new landscapes into the chalk and clay, gouging out basins that would later fill with rivers and lakes. It pushed debris before it like bulldozers, creating ridges of till that still mark ancient frontiers across eastern England. The Bitham River, once a great artery of life, was obliterated. Its valley was erased so thoroughly that for decades scientists didn't even know it had existed until they found fragments of its ancient gravels far from where any river flows today. The Thames, too, was forced from its course, its bed blocked by the encroaching ice. The river was diverted southward, eventually carving the path it follows now through London. The entire geography of Britain was rewritten in a single glacial episode. What had once been an open landscape of forests and wetlands became an Arctic desert of ice and wind. No humans, as far as we know, survived here during that time. The fossil record falls silent. Tools vanish. Bones vanish. Even the soil itself seems to disappear, locked beneath layers of glacial debris. For tens of thousands of years there is no sign of life beyond what could endure the permafrost. Mosses, hardy grasses, and the ghosts of animals that migrated south or died in the attempt. In the absence of warm seasons, rivers froze and burst apart, lakes drained into tunnels beneath the ice, and the very ground moved under the pressure of glaciers that crept and heaved like slow, grinding tides. The Anglian ice sheet extended farther south than any that would follow. Its frozen edge reached into the Midlands and perhaps as far as the Scilly Isles, covering nearly all of Britain. In places where the ice could not reach, meltwater carved enormous valleys that remain visible today. One of the most remarkable legacies of this period lies deep beneath the English Channel. As the glaciers advanced, they trapped meltwater into massive glacial lakes, north of the chalk ridge that once connected Britain to France. When that natural dam finally broke, torrents of water exploded through the chalk, scouring a valley that became the Dover Strait. With that cataclysmic flood, the seeds were planted for Britain's eventual separation from the continent. But for now, there were no witnesses, no eyes to see the destruction or feel the cold. The first great silence of human history in Britain had begun. It is strange to think that even absence leaves evidence, yet it does. Scientists can trace this silence in layers of earth. Beneath the glacial deposits, they find the warm interglacial soils of Boxgrove and Happisburgh, rich with fossils and tools. Above them, only sterile sands and clays, pressed flat by the crushing weight of ice. This transition, life to nothing, is what marks the Anglian so clearly in the geological record. It is a scar across time, a frozen pause between worlds. To imagine what this landscape looked like requires a suspension of everything we know about Britain. The country's rolling hills, green valleys, and mild rain would not exist for hundreds of thousands of years. Instead, vast plains of ice reached from horizon to horizon. Where mountains broke through the white, they stood as islands in a frozen sea. Winds, unbroken by forest or city, screamed across the tundra, driving blizzards that buried everything in silence. Even the sun low in the sky offered little warmth. Day and night blurred into an endless blue-grey dusk. For geologists, the clues to this vanished Britain are found not only in Ice Age sediments, but in the way the land itself still carries memory. Across East Anglia and the Midlands, strange patterns of ridges and valleys mark the routes of meltwater rivers that flowed beneath the glaciers. In some areas, massive boulders of Scandinavian rock sit incongruously in English fields, erratics carried hundreds of miles by the ice before being dropped as it melted. Pebbles from ancient seabeds are mixed into layers of clay deposited by glaciers that ploughed through everything they encountered. Each of these fragments is a sentence in the story of the Great Freeze. Even the soil chemistry changed. As ice advanced, it scraped away the fertile top layers, exposing raw chalk and sand. When the ice retreated thousands of years later, it left behind a landscape so altered that it would take entire ecosystems to rebuild it. In this way, the Anglian glaciation was both a destroyer and a sculptor. It erased the Britain that had been, but it also laid the groundwork for the Britain that would come. The Thames Valley, the Weald, the estuaries of East Anglia, all were shaped, directly or indirectly, by that glacial episode. There is a humility in studying this time. The evidence is immense, but also fragmented, scattered across quarries, cliffs and cores drilled deep into the earth. Every new discovery redefines our sense of scale. When scientists first realised how far south the Anglian ice had reached, it upended the chronology of early Britain. It explained why there was such a long break in the archaeological record, why Homo heidelbergensis vanished, why for nearly 50,000 years there were no human tools or bones to be found. The answer was simple and final. There was no one left here to leave them. In the centuries that followed the maximum of the Anglian, the glaciers began their slow retreat. The ice melted not all at once, but in fits and starts, retreating northward as the planet warmed. Meltwater poured into the valleys, carrying with it silt, gravel and broken stone. It flooded the lowlands, carving new paths for rivers, and left behind wide terraces that still define the shape of British landscapes today. Yet even as the ice withdrew, the memory of it remained in the land structure and in its silence. When warmth returned and new animals wandered back from the south, they stepped into a country utterly transformed. What fascinates scientists is not just the destruction itself, but how the planet recovered. Pollen cores show that within a few thousand years of the ice's retreat, tundra plants were followed by hardy shrubs, then by birch and pine, and finally by mixed forests. The resilience of life is astonishing. but it always comes at a cost. Many species did not return. Entire lineages of large mammals vanished from Britain forever. Others would recolonize in altered form, their ancestors having survived in refuges far to the south. For early humans, those returning pioneers, the Britain they would one day rediscover bore little resemblance to the land their forebears had known. We sometimes imagine the Ice Age as a single event, but it was more like a rhythm, a slow breathing of cold and warmth across millions of years. The Anglian was one of its deepest inhales. During those frozen millennia, the Earth's tilt and orbit changed just enough to alter the balance of sunlight reaching the northern hemisphere. Tiny shifts in atmosphere and ocean circulation cascaded into a planetary transformation. Ice spread, sea levels fell by tens of meters, and ecosystems collapsed in a chain reaction of cold. Yet, from the planet's perspective, it was only a momentary pulse. When we look back on this period, it is easy to focus on the absence of humans, but perhaps that absence is what gives it meaning. The land did not need us to change. Climate, gravity, and time were more powerful sculptors than any tool. The Great Freeze was a reminder written in stone that Earth's history is not human history, even though we now live upon its ruins. Standing on the cliffs of Sussex or the fens of Norfolk today, you're looking across landscapes born out of that silence. Beneath your feet, in the gravels of ancient rivers, lie the echoes of a world that froze, shattered, and began again. In the end, survival was not possible here. The world itself disappeared under ice, and for a long while there was no one left to see it. Yet when the glaciers melted and the rivers returned, life began its quiet work once more. The first great silence in Britain's story gave way to a new beginning, one written not by catastrophe, but by endurance. And perhaps that is the larger truth of this frozen age, that even when the world erases itself, it eventually remembers how to breathe again. Imagine standing on the edge of a thawing world. The ice has begun to melt, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in slow drips and floods that reshape the land inch by inch. Beneath the grey-blue sky of a new interglacial, rivers awaken, carrying meltwater across a continent scarred by glaciers. The silence of the Anglian freeze breaks at last, not with thunder, but with trickles, winds, and the quiet footsteps of life returning. For tens of thousands of years, Britain had been a dead zone of ice and stone, but now green pushes through the white. Birch and pine spread across the valleys, followed by willow, oak, and hazel. Herds of deer, wild horses, and even elephants moved northward again, reclaiming land that had not seen breath in ages, and somewhere among them, perhaps following the same game trails carved through the mud and thaw, the first humans returned too. We do not know their names or faces, but their traces speak clearly from the soil of southern England. They came not as conquerors, but as cautious explorers, crossing once more from the continental plains into the land we now call Britain, still connected by a wide chalk land bridge. The ice had retreated north, revealing fertile valleys and winding rivers rich with fish and game. For the first time in nearly 50,000 years, people, descendants of Homo heidelbergensis, perhaps already branching toward the form that would become Neanderthal, stepped back into this reborn land. They were not the same as those who had left. Somewhere in the time between the Great Freeze and their return they had learned something new. They carried with them not only stone, but flame. At sites like Swanscombe in Kent and Clacton-on-Sea in Essex, the fragments of this reoccupation lie buried among the sediments of ancient riverbanks. The Thames had long since changed its course, now flowing along a new southern route cut during the glacial chaos. Along its shores, archaeologists have found the tools of these new inhabitants, carefully shaped hand axes, flakes, and most remarkably the oldest known wooden spear ever discovered in Britain. The Clacton spear, as it is known, dates to around 400,000 years ago. It was made from a single sharpened branch of yew wood, hardened at the tip by scraping and perhaps by heat. It is simple but deliberate, the kind of object that could only come from a mind that understood both planning and material. To hold it, even through glass, is to feel the first heartbeat of human craftsmanship in Britain after the ice. But the Clacton spear is more than an artifact, it is a window into survival. The world these people returned to was not mild or stable. Interglacial Britain was warm, even lush, but unpredictable. Summers were long and hot, winters sharp and dry. Great beasts roamed its forests, elephants with straight tusks, hippos wallowing in the rivers, lions stalking the open plains. To live among them required awareness, cooperation, and invention. The hunters of Clacton and Swanscombe did not merely react to the world around them, they shaped it. Their tools were evolving. Across Europe and soon in Britain, a new method of stoneworking began to appear. Instead of simply striking flakes from a core at random, these early humans learned to prepare the core in advance, shaping it so that each blow would release a flake of predictable size and form. This method, known today as the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 technique, marked a quiet revolution. It required abstract thinking, an ability to imagine the final tool before it existed, and to plan the sequence of actions that would create it. It is a form of geometry in stone. To master it was to begin thinking in steps, to see the world not only as it was, but as it could be transformed. In the flint-rich cliffs and river terraces of southern England, we find both old and new, traditional hand axes alongside 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐿, suggesting a time of transition. These were not two separate worlds, but one evolving species learning new tricks of cognition. Whether this innovation spread by contact or was rediscovered independently, we cannot say for certain. What we do know is that the makers of these tools were already experimenting with precision, economy, and control. They no longer carried a large array of tools for every possible task. Instead, they carried a few prepared cores from which many tools could be struck when needed. It was efficiency born of understanding, and it would serve them well in the volatile climates to come. The archaeological record suggests these people lived in small groups, moving along river valleys and coastal plains, scavenging and hunting according to the seasons. They likely built temporary shelters from wood and hides, though none survive. Their diet would have been rich and varied: deer, bison, horse, fish, and the occasional bird or small mammal. But their survival advantage may have rested not only in what they ate, but in what they could make burn. Fire, controlled, sustained, and shared, enters Britain's story here for the first time. At sites like Swanscombe and Beecher's Pit near Suffolk, layers of charcoal and reddened earth suggest that hearths once burned there around 400,000 years ago. The evidence is not always easy to interpret. Natural wildfires can leave similar marks, and the line between human and geological activity is faint after so much time. But in the case of Beecher's Pit, the pattern of burned sediment and associated stone tools leaves little doubt. Fire had been made and used deliberately. Imagine that scene: dusk on the edge of a forest, the air cooling as the sun fades behind distant hills. A group of hunters gathers around a small pit where the embers glow softly. Sparks drift into the dark. The smell of roasted marrow and smoke clings to the air. For the first time in hundreds of millennia, light and warmth push back the cold in this land. Fire meant more than survival, it meant control. With it, they could drive away predators, cook food, harden wooden spears, and endure the long nights. Fire also changed how they saw each other. Around its glow, faces became visible, stories and gestures shared. In those moments, cooperation deepened. and memory began to take root in a way that no other creature had known. And yet, for all its power, fire was fragile. A single rainstorm could destroy it. There is no sign these early people could create fire from scratch. More likely, they carried embers from one place to another, keeping them alive through skill and vigilance. They were, in the truest sense, firekeepers, protectors of a borrowed flame. The landscape they inhabited was one of constant flux. Geological and climatic data reveal that during this period, Britain oscillated between warmer and cooler phases within the broader interglacial. Forests expanded, then receded. Rivers flooded, then dried. Each shift forced adaptation. When the temperatures dropped again around 300,000 years ago, the open grasslands gave way to tundra-like plains. The humans of Britain either retreated southward once more or found ways to survive at the margins, following herds that migrated toward milder regions. One of the most intriguing finds from this era comes not from a tool, but from a skull. At Swanscombe, fragments of a female cranium dating to roughly 400,000 years ago reveal features transitional between 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐏𝐒 and Neanderthal. Her brain case was large, her brow less pronounced, her face wide and strong. She represents a moment of transformation, a lineage on the brink of becoming something new. She would not have known it, of course. To her, life was simply life, the endless pattern of finding food, tending fire, and following the rhythms of the land. But through her bones we see evolution itself at work. When we piece together this time from stone and soil, a portrait begins to emerge, not of isolated events, but of endurance. These people lived without writing, without art, without permanence. They did not leave monuments or myths, and yet they persisted through one of the most volatile periods in Earth's history. They learned to use fire not as magic but as a tool, to shape stone with foresight, to plan hunts and migrations with understanding of season and terrain. They were not us, but they were thinking like us. The roots of human adaptability, of our species' strange ability to not just survive change but to harness it, are visible here in their quiet successes. The interglacial that welcomed them would not last forever. Around 250,000 years ago, the climate began to turn again, sliding toward another cold phase. Forests thinned. Ice once more advanced from the north. Britain's land bridge would narrow as sea levels dropped, closing the chapter of these first firemakers. They would leave behind their tools, their hearths, their bones, and the marks of their existence impressed into ancient river clay. The next time humans returned, they would not be quite the same. Every handful of soil from Clacton or Swanscombe holds this memory, the story of a species that returned to a ruined land and rebuilt it with intelligence and flame. And perhaps the most humbling truth is this: they did so without knowing how fragile that warmth was. The ice would come again, the rivers would shift again. But for a brief span of geological time, Britain lived, breathed, and burned once more. What if I told you that Britain was once ruled by another kind of human, one who walked its frozen valleys, hunted its mammoths, and watched the same moon that we do, but spoke a language the earth itself has forgotten? For nearly 200,000 years, Neanderthals were not strangers here. They were the people of this land. They built fires against the long glacial winds, hunted through forests of reindeer and bison, and raised children who laughed and cried beneath the same pale skies that would one day see us. And yet, when we imagine human history, we speak of them as a side story, a prelude. But what if it was the other way around? When the ice of the Anglian glaciation finally withdrew, and Britain once again grew green, it was the Neanderthals who inherited it. Around 250,000 years ago, the descendants of 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐏𝐒, heavy-browed, muscular, intelligent, had evolved into a distinct species. They were not primitive. They were the result of hundreds of millennia of adaptation to Europe's extremes. Their bones tell us that they were stockier and stronger than us, their limbs shorter, their chests broader. These were not flaws but solutions. In the freezing climates of Pleistocene Britain, a compact body conserved heat and gave power to endurance. Their tools, too, reveal a mind that was both precise and practical. Across southern Britain, archaeologists find traces of what we now call the Middle Paleolithic: flint hand axes, scrapers, and points shaped with astonishing control using the Levallois technique. This was not crude stone bashing, but a craft of memory and foresight. Each flake struck from a core had been planned before the first blow. The design was held in the mind. A thought turned into geometry. To make one of these tools required patience, coordination, and an understanding of stone that was almost intimate. Some archaeologists say the marks of their tools show that Neanderthals were not simply efficient, they were consistent. They thought in patterns. At sites like Linford in Norfolk, we find the remains of their world frozen in time, a scatter of flint flakes surrounding the bones of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and reindeer. Among them, wooden spears were found, carved from straight tree branches and blackened by fire at their tips. The evidence tells us they hunted large game at close range, driving animals toward traps or narrow crossings before striking. It is easy to imagine these hunts as violent struggles, but they were also acts of coordination and understanding. A mammoth could weigh 10 times more than the hunters that faced it. Success required planning, communication, and courage. They were not brutes, they were strategists. The Neanderthal face, reconstructed from fossils found at Swanscombe, Pontnewydd, and other British sites, tells another part of the story. The skull is wide, the brow heavy, the nose large and projecting. An adaptation, scientists think, for warming cold air before it reached the lungs. Their teeth were strong, their jaws powerful, but the shape of their brain case hints at a complexity often underestimated. Neanderthal brains were, on average, larger than ours. The difference lies not in size, but in structure. They devoted more space to vision and physical control, useful in dim light and dangerous hunts, but their capacity for planning and empathy was also profound. We know they cared for their injured. Fossil evidence from Europe shows Neanderthals with healed fractures, severe arthritis, and even missing limbs who survived long after their injuries, meaning others must have tended to them. They must have shared food, helped each other move, and kept the fires alive together. This is not sentimentality, it is data. Altruism leaves traces in bones. The Britain they knew was not the soft green island we see today. The climate swung wildly. During warm periods, oak and elm forests spread across the valleys, and rivers teemed with fish. During the cold spells, the land turned to open tundra. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, and snow lingered for months. Yet the Neanderthals endured. When the cold came, they migrated south toward the continent, following the great herds across the grasslands that connected Britain to Europe. When warmth returned, they came back. For nearly 200,000 years they repeated this pattern, leaving and returning like the tides. In these cycles they left behind their camps, their hearths, and their tools. At La Côte de Saint-Brelade, just off the coast of Jersey, cliffs preserve the remains of butchered mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses driven over the edge by coordinated groups of hunters. Similar behaviours may have occurred on the mainland. This was not mere survival, it was knowledge passed down through generations, a shared memory of landscapes, migrations and strategies. To stand at a Neanderthal site today is to feel time folded upon itself. The flint flakes, the bones, the layers of charcoal are all that remain of lives that were fully human in their own way. Around their fires, they may have spoken, perhaps not in language as we know it, but in tone, rhythm, and gesture. Studies of the Neanderthal throat and ear bones suggest they were capable of producing and hearing complex vocal sounds. The possibility of speech is not fantasy. It is evolution's logic. Communication is what cooperation demands. And then there is emotion. The idea that Neanderthals felt deeply is not wishful thinking. It is emerging evidence. The care shown in burials at sites across Europe, the adornment of some with flowers or pigments, the tenderness implied by healed injuries, these all point toward awareness beyond instinct. They experienced fear, relief, grief, perhaps even affection. Their minds were not blank slates. They were mirrors of their harsh but vivid world. In the depths of winter, they would have gathered in shelters of branches and hides, their fires burning low, smoke seeping into the cold air. They may have told each other about hunts gone wrong, or remembered those who did not return. The flicker of firelight on their faces would have been almost indistinguishable from ours. The same eyes watching the same flame, knowing the same mixture of exhaustion and hope. The Neanderthal story in Britain is not continuous, though. Climate repeatedly fractured their occupation. The great cold phases, especially the one that began around 180,000 years ago, drove them out again and again. When the glaciers advanced, sea levels dropped, and Britain became an unlivable tundra. Yet whenever the ice retreated, they came back. This rhythm lasted for nearly 200,000 years, longer than all of recorded human history combined. At 𝐓𝐿𝐌𝐿𝐿𝐿𝐿 cave in Wales, archaeologists discovered the teeth and bones of Neanderthal children, dating to roughly 200,000 years ago, mixed with animal remains and stone tools. These were not fleeting visitors. They were families. The caves offered shelter from wind and predators. Fires lit within them left layers of soot that still cling to the limestone. It is not hard to imagine the laughter of children echoing softly in those dark chambers, their parents' flaking tools nearby, the smell of cooking meat filling the air. Every fossil fragment, every tool, every burnt patch of earth adds to a portrait of persistence. These were people who mastered the cold, who thrived in cycles of change that would have destroyed less adaptable species. Their extinction, whenever it finally came, was not due to failure of intellect or spirit, but of circumstance. For hundreds of millennia, they were the most successful humans on this part of the planet. What remains of them in Britain is subtle but powerful, a handprint on flint, a footprint in mud, a fragment of skull in gravel. From these small traces, science rebuilds an entire world. When we look closely enough, we see not difference, but kinship. They were shaped by the same evolutionary pressures that shaped us, driven by the same needs: food, warmth, connection, survival. And though we will never hear their voices, the stones they left behind still speak. In the end, perhaps the greatest mistake we make is thinking of the Neanderthals as lost or lesser. They were neither. They ruled Britain in their own age, not through conquest, but through endurance. They lived here longer than we have yet managed. When we measure our time on this island, a few thousand years of cities, walls and wars, it is almost nothing compared to theirs. They watched the land freeze and thaw again and again, and they adapted. Theirs was an intelligence not of invention, but of harmony, of surviving without destroying. Standing in the chalk valleys where their tools are still found, it is hard not to feel a kind of reverence. The wind that sweeps across the downs has touched the same ridges, carried the same dust. The bones buried in ancient riverbeds are not relics of strangers. They are reminders of what humanity once was, before we divided it into us and them. And so the question that lingers is not what ended the Neanderthals, but what we might still learn from them. For 200,000 years they lived through extremes that our species has only begun to face again. They endured without monuments, without empire, without arrogance. They survived because they belonged to their world, not apart from it. And maybe, in that sense, they were wiser than us. What if I told you that half of Britain still exists but under the waves? Beneath the restless grey waters of the North Sea lies a world that once joined England to Europe, a land of rivers, forests and herds that stretched as far as the eye could see. Before the sea swallowed it, this vanished continent was called Doggerland, a name borrowed from a sandbank used by fishermen, but its true borders were vast. Between 125,000 and 70,000 years ago, it was the heart of Ice Age Europe, a bridge for animals and people alike. And though today it lies silent beneath the tides, its memory is written in the sediments of the seabed, in the bones dredged from the deep, and in the fossils of creatures who once walked a country that no longer exists. When the great ice sheets of the Anglian and Wolstonian ages withdrew, they left behind a low, fertile plain stretching from modern Britain to Denmark and the Netherlands. Sea levels were far lower than today, up to 100 metres lower. The North Sea basin, now cold and wild, was once a network of rivers feeding into a vast freshwater lake at its centre. Scientists have mapped this lost landscape using sonar and seismic scans, revealing hills, valleys, and ancient coastlines still intact beneath the mud. The geography was gentle, broad river deltas, rolling grasslands, and wide marshes. To stand there then would have been to see Britain not as an island, but as the northwestern edge of a single immense plain. For Neanderthals, Doggerland was a paradise. Between the ice ages, the region enjoyed temperate climates, with summers warm enough to support forests of birch, pine and oak, and winters cold but survivable. Herds of bison, red deer and wild horse roamed freely. Woolly mammoths grazed on the plains, alongside woolly rhinoceroses and reindeer during cooler intervals. Lions and hyenas hunted them, as did packs of wolves that followed the migrations along the ancient rivers. These were not Arctic wastes, but living ecosystems, as rich in life as the African savannas would one day be. The rivers of Doggerland were among the most important features of this world. The largest, the so-called Channel River, carried meltwater from the Thames, Rhine and Meuse across the plain to the Atlantic. Along its banks, Neanderthals hunted and built temporary camps, using the natural channels to track herds and navigate the land. Archaeological evidence dredged from the seafloor tells this story in fragments. Flint tools shaped by human hands, animal bones scored by cuts, and even ancient peat deposits preserving traces of pollen and plants. Every find speaks of a landscape once walked, lived in, and known intimately. Imagine it. A group of Neanderthal hunters standing at dawn on the banks of one of Doggerland's rivers. Mist drifts over the water, lit by the low golden sun. Their breath hangs in the air as they scan the horizon, waiting for the distant shapes of mammoth or deer to emerge from the haze. The land stretches endlessly around them, unbroken by sea. To the south, the forests shimmer with birdsong. To the north, the distant glimmer of ice caps marks the edge of the known world. Somewhere nearby, smoke rises from a camp where others keep the fire alive. In this moment, Britain is not an island. It is part of the continent's beating heart. What makes Doggerland so extraordinary is not only its scale, but its endurance. For tens of thousands of years, it served as a corridor for migration. During warm periods, it allowed animals and humans to move freely between Britain and mainland Europe. During cold periods, when glaciers advanced, it offered refuge in its southern valleys. This pattern of retreat and return shaped everything about Ice Age life. The people who lived here, almost certainly Neanderthals for most of this period, were experts in mobility. They knew how to read the seasons, follow herds, and exploit rivers for fish and waterfowl. They were at home in change itself. The sediments of the North Sea floor preserve extraordinary glimpses into this vanished world. Trawlers have brought up mammoth tusks the size of tree trunks, antlers from giant elk, and bones from lions and bears. Alongside them appear finely worked stone tools, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 flakes, hand axes and scrapers, dating to around 100,000 years ago. These artifacts prove beyond doubt that Doggerland was not just a passageway but a homeland. For generations, humans hunted, gathered, and raised their children here. They left footprints that are now buried beneath sand and silt. What we know of Doggerland's environment comes not only from fossils but from the microscopic record. Pollen grains preserved in ancient peat. These tiny archives reveal forests of hazel and alder, grasslands dotted with wildflowers, and marshes rich in reeds. The air would have carried the smell of water and soil, the calls of cranes and ducks. In summer, it would have been green and buzzing with life. In winter, quiet and silvered by frost. It is easy to think of the Ice Age as endless cold, but Doggerland reminds us that it was a place of cycles, of thaw and freeze, abundance and scarcity. During the warm Eemian interglacial around 125,000 years ago, Doggerland reached its most fertile state. The glaciers had melted back almost entirely, and sea levels rose but not enough to submerge the plain. For a few millennia, this land was lush and stable. Neanderthals thrived, building seasonal camps and perhaps returning to familiar sites year after year. They hunted large animals with wooden spears hardened by fire and used stone tools with edges so fine that they could skin a deer or carve a bone needle. These were not transient wanderers, but people with memory. People who knew where to find flint, where to fish, and where the herds would cross. Then the climate shifted again. Around 100,000 years ago, the planet began to cool, and the ice sheets advanced once more. The grasslands of Doggerland turned first to tundra, then to permafrost. Rivers froze, forests died back, and the animals that had fed the Neanderthals moved south. The sea level began to fall again as water was locked into ice, turning the plains into a colder, harsher landscape. Yet even in these conditions, life persisted. Reindeer replaced deer, steppe bison replaced red deer, and the hunters followed. They learned to use caves for shelter when the winds grew fierce, and to huddle by firelight in makeshift shelters of hide and bone. Every interglacial and glacial cycle redrew the map of their world. When warmth returned, Doggerland bloomed again. When the cold returned, it hardened. Through all of it, the Neanderthals adapted, their lives moving in rhythm with the heartbeat of climate. This resilience is what defines them, not their extinction. Their relationship with Doggerland was one of reciprocity. The land provided, and they learned its language. It is humbling to think that the North Sea we know today was once a place of birth, migration, and death. Beneath those waters lie the remains of mammoth trails and campfires, of rivers that have not flowed for tens of thousands of years. Sonar scans even suggest the outlines of ancient lake basins and possible dune systems where hunters may have once camped. When storm surges tear up the seafloor, they sometimes expose these hidden layers for a moment before the sea covers them again. It is as though the past still stirs beneath the waves, reaching up to remind us that our planet is never still. We cannot yet fully map Doggerland's human story. The sea has taken too much. But what we have found suggests that Neanderthals were here longer than any other humans before or after them. They lived through shifting climates, across changing rivers and coasts, and adapted each time. Their world was one of vast horizons and uncertainty, and yet they endured for nearly 200,000 years in northwestern Europe. That span dwarfs our own presence here. To imagine Doggerland today is to glimpse the scale of time itself. If you could drain the North Sea, you would see the ghosts of valleys, the branching scars of ancient rivers, and the places where families once gathered around fires to eat, rest, and plan the next day's hunt. The bones of mammoths and the tools of their hunters lie side by side, as though they had only just been left there. The silence of the deep is deceptive. It hides one of the richest landscapes ever to have existed in human prehistory. Perhaps that is the lesson of Doggerland, that nothing is truly lost, only transformed. The same geological forces that buried it created the Britain we know today. The waves that conceal it now will someday reshape the coasts again. And while we can no longer walk those plains, the echo of our earliest kin still lingers there, beneath the tides, beneath the storms, beneath the grey shifting surface of the sea. Imagine walking across a cold plain that no longer exists, a tundra stretching from France to what would one day be called England. The wind cuts through layers of fur and hide, carrying the scent of mammoth herds moving in the distance. The sun is pale, the rivers are wide, and in the long twilight, a small group of humans makes camp near a line of cliffs that rise above a frozen valley. They build their fires carefully, as if aware that they are being watched, for they are not the first people here. Beneath the same cliffs lie the bones and tools of others who came long before them, heavier boned, broad-faced, now gone from sight but not yet from memory. Around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens finally reached the land that would become Britain. They arrived not as conquerors, but as wanderers following herds and opportunity. By this time, modern humans had already crossed much of Eurasia, adapting to forests, steppes, and ice. The journey into northwestern Europe was one of the last steps in that long expansion from Africa. The world they entered was fragile and unstable. The climate was caught between warmth and ice, swinging back and forth over short intervals. Britain, still connected to the continent by low plains and river valleys, was a cold, open country of grass and sparse woodland. It was a temporary refuge at the edge of the Ice Age, habitable, but only barely. The first traces of our species here are faint but unmistakable. At Kent's Cavern in Devon, a single fragment of upper jawbone dated to roughly 44,000 years ago holds the oldest evidence of Homo sapiens in Britain. Its discovery pushed back the timeline of our arrival by thousands of years. The bone itself is small, almost delicate compared to the robust remains of Neanderthals found elsewhere, but its shape is unmistakably human, our kind of human. Its owner may have belonged to a small band moving north from the valleys of France or Belgium, following herds across what was then a wide and frozen steppe. These people brought with them a new way of making things. Across Europe at this time, a cultural and technological shift was unfolding, what archaeologists call the Aurignacian tradition. The tools of this period were unlike anything seen before in Britain. Instead of large flakes or heavy hand axes, they crafted long, thin blades from carefully prepared stone cores. These blades were light, sharp, and adaptable, easy to fit into wooden handles as knives, spear tips, or scrapers. They also worked bone and antler into fine points and barbs, materials that had rarely been used by earlier humans. To make such tools required precision and imagination, not just the understanding of stone, but of design. At sites like Uphill Quarry and High Lodge, fragments of blade tools and flakes hint at the presence of these early modern humans. The finds are scattered, small, and often difficult to date, but together they tell a quiet story. Brief visits, temporary camps, hunting grounds that appeared when the climate warmed enough to allow life to return. These were not permanent settlers. They came and went with the seasons, their migrations guided by the rhythm of cold and thaw. The landscape they walked through was changing constantly. Around 40,000 years ago, Britain's climate entered one of its rare, mild phases. Forests of birch and pine spread across the lowlands, attracting herds of horse and reindeer, while rivers like the Thames and the Severn flowed broad and strong. For a few centuries it must have felt like the world was opening again after long hardship. But this warmth was deceptive, a brief interlude before the cold returned in force. And somewhere in those forests and river valleys they may have met others. For a time, Neanderthals still lingered in Western Europe. By 40,000 years ago, their populations were dwindling, but they had not yet vanished. Fossil evidence from nearby regions suggests there was overlap, a few thousand years where both species shared the same lands. Whether they met in Britain or only further south, we cannot be certain. But the possibility remains that the first Homo sapiens to walk these valleys encountered the last Neanderthals who called them home. Perhaps they watched each other across a river or a clearing, cautious and curious. Two kinds of humans shaped by different worlds. If they did meet, the encounters were likely rare and brief. The archaeological record of this time is a patchwork, broken by the volatility of climate. The ice advanced and retreated repeatedly. Each time the cold deepened, the land became uninhabitable again, forcing both humans and animals to retreat southward toward warmer regions. Then, when the ice receded, life returned once more. It was an age of migrations, of constant loss and renewal. Yet even in this shifting world, our ancestors carried with them small revolutions. The Aurignacian blade was one, another was organisation. These groups likely travelled in bands of a few dozen people, families bound by cooperation, memory and language. Around their fires, they could share knowledge in ways no previous species could. This ability to communicate complex ideas, to teach and plan collectively, was our most powerful adaptation. It allowed us to survive in places that logic alone would have warned us against. At some sites in Britain and northern France, evidence of coordinated hunting appears. The remains of multiple large animals, butchered in ways that suggest planning rather than chance. Spears tipped with stone or bone could be thrown from a distance, reducing the danger of close combat. The Aurignacian people were learning not only to use tools, but to amplify their reach. Their technology became an extension of their thinking. Still, the cold never stopped reminding them of fragility. Around 35,000 years ago, the climate turned once again. Temperatures dropped sharply, glaciers expanded across northern Europe, and Britain grew desolate and barren. Forests retreated, rivers froze, and the herds moved south. The people who had returned with such promise vanished again from the archaeological record. The evidence of their brief presence, the blades, the bones, the scattered hearths, marks only a pause in a larger story. Britain, it seems, was still not ready for us. What remains most striking about this time is how little we truly know. The fragments we find, a jaw, a blade, a few hearths of ash, represent thousands of lives reduced to whispers. Yet each discovery reminds us of how recent our arrival really was. For nearly 1 million years, other humans had walked this land. Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals. All of them came and went through cycles of ice and thaw, leaving behind traces in riverbeds and caves. When Homo sapiens finally arrived, it was not as a sudden replacement, but as part of that same rhythm. We were simply the latest wave. What made us different, though, was not just anatomy or technology, it was imagination. The Aurignacian tools were more than functional. They represented planning, design, and foresight. To create something in advance of need requires the ability to imagine a future, and to imagine a future is, in a sense, to defy extinction. In those early millennia, the humans of Britain lived on the edge of survival, between cold and warmth, between presence and disappearance. Yet they left behind the first tangible signs of what we might call continuity. Traditions of tool-making, ways of moving across the landscape, and perhaps even the beginnings of shared memory. When they vanished again around 30,000 years ago, they did so into a world that would soon face its greatest challenge, the last and deepest cold of the Ice Age. But the pattern was now set. Each time the ice withdrew, humans would return, bringing with them new skills, new ideas, and new stories. The first modern humans in Britain may have come and gone in a handful of generations, but they began a legacy that would eventually outlast the glaciers themselves. The land they walked would freeze again and again, but it would never again be entirely empty. Beneath the shifting layers of time, their presence still lingers, in the bones buried under Devon soil, in the stone blades weathered by ancient rivers, and in the quiet certainty that every return to this island is, in some way, a homecoming. Imagine standing where London will one day be, but there is no river here, only a wall of ice. The ground beneath your feet is frozen rock, fractured and scraped clean by centuries of glacial weight. The air burns with cold, so dry that your breath feels like dust. There are no trees, no birdsong, no sound at all but the wind moving across endless snow. This is not a winter, it is an age. Around 30,000 years ago, Britain entered the grip of its final great freeze, the last glacial maximum, a time when ice ruled more of this land than ever before, and for longer than almost any human memory could hold. By then, Homo sapiens had already walked here and left again. The early pioneers of the Auronian period had vanished thousands of years earlier, retreating south as the cold closed in. What returned in their place was not another wave of people, but the ice itself. Glaciers grew across Scotland and northern England, merging into a vast ice sheet that stretched from the Atlantic to the North Sea and south, almost to the Thames Valley. To the north lay nothing but white silence. To the south, frozen tundra scattered with the bones of the animals that still clung to life. The climate of this world defies our modern imagination. Average temperatures in Britain fell by more than 20 degrees below today's. For thousands of years, even summer meant little warmth. During the deepest phase of the cold, between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, ice nearly a kilometre thick blanketed the north. The weight of it pressed the land downward by hundreds of metres, reshaping rivers, burying valleys, and grinding mountains to dust. The glaciers moved slowly, but with unstoppable power, carving U-shaped valleys and depositing moraines that still define parts of the modern landscape. Britain was not so much an island now as an extension of the Eurasian plain. Sea levels had dropped more than 100 metres, exposing vast stretches of land across what is now the North Sea. Doggerland, reborn but uninhabitable in this bitter cold. The Channel was a frozen plain, its rivers braided and choked with ice. Only the most cold-adapted species survived in this world, and even they were pushed to their limits. In this frozen Britain, herds of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros moved slowly across the tundra, scraping lichen and frozen grasses from the ground. Steppe bison, reindeer, and wild horses followed, migrating in vast circles as they searched for the sparse patches of edible vegetation that emerged in the brief summer thaw. The great carnivores of the age followed them: cave lions, dire wolves, and the massive short-faced bear. But even predators struggled to survive here. The food chain itself thinned with the ice. To the south, in warmer refuges across France and Spain, small populations of humans endured, bands of hunters and gatherers who had adapted to the cold edge of the world. From their caves they watched the glaciers advance like living things, swallowing valleys they had once known. For thousands of years Britain was unreachable, too hostile even for them. It became in every sense a lost land, a place that vanished from human memory. And yet, it was not a lifeless void. In the brief windows between deep freezes, tiny bursts of life returned. Pollen records show that during slightly milder centuries, patches of tundra grassland gave way to dwarf willow, birch, and even hardy shrubs. Insects, birds, and small mammals reappeared. The Mammoth Steppe, that strange, open ecosystem of Ice Age Eurasia, pulsed with rhythm, expanding and retreating with each fluctuation of climate. The land itself seemed to breathe, exhaling life for a few hundred years before inhaling ice again. The story of this frozen Britain is written not in bones or tools, but in sediments. Beneath modern soils, layers of clay and silt record the rise and fall of temperature, each stratum a whisper of thaw or freeze. From these layers, scientists can reconstruct a world without people. A Britain dominated entirely by climate and chance. The rivers we know today were then slow-moving meltwater channels beneath ice, carving tunnels through the glacier or emerging briefly in summer before freezing solid once more. In the few areas that escaped total glaciation, small refuges in southern England, the landscape resembled Arctic tundra. Frost shattered rock into gravel and dust, and permafrost froze the soil so deeply that even roots could not take hold. When the wind blew, it carried fine sediment across the plains, depositing thick layers of loess that would one day become fertile ground for future forests. It is an eerie thought that the very soils that nourished later Britain were born from the grinding of ice that had erased it. For perhaps 15,000 years, no human foot touched this land. The silence of that absence is hard to fathom. We tend to think of prehistory as a constant story of people, one species replacing another, always building toward the present. But for millennia at a time, entire regions vanished from the human map. Britain during the last glacial maximum was such a place, a blank space on the edge of the known world. What remained were only animals and ice, locked in an endless cycle of hunger and endurance. The mammoth herds likely migrated across exposed plains that stretched from Germany to the western edge of Ireland. They followed the same routes for generations, perhaps guided by memory, though each year the landscape changed beneath them. The rivers they crossed shifted, frozen and refrozen. Calves were born into a world where the sun never rose high, and the horizon was always white. Eventually even they dwindled as the cold deepened. It is tempting to imagine these millennia as static, a frozen tableau, but even ice moves. Beneath its surface, glacial rivers carried gravel and sediment toward the coasts, reshaping the contours of the land. Ice advanced, then paused, then retreated again. Each fluctuation redrew the map. When the climate warmed slightly, the meltwater poured southward in torrents, carving out great valleys that would later cradle the Thames and the Severn. Then the cold returned, sealing them once again beneath ice. By 20,000 years ago, the British ice sheet had reached its maximum size. Its southern edge lay near the Bristol Channel and the Midlands, forming a glittering frontier between death and survival. To the south, scattered tundra supported a few hardy species, reindeer, steppe bison, and Arctic fox. To the north, nothing lived at all. The ice stretched over mountains and moorlands, meeting the Scandinavian glaciers somewhere beneath what is now the North Sea. The animals that survived here were shaped by the cold. Mammoths were smaller than their Siberian cousins, their thick coats adapted to the moist chill of maritime air. Reindeer migrated in immense herds, their hooves wide and soft to walk on snow. Even the wolves of this age had evolved into giants, built for endurance across open tundra. Britain was one of the westernmost outposts of this Ice Age ecosystem, a world that stretched across continents, connecting Europe, Asia, and even North America in one continuous belt of frozen grassland. But by 15,000 years ago, change was beginning again. The sun's path shifted, Earth's orbit tilted slightly, and the glaciers began to melt. Slowly, water returned to the land. Great meltwater lakes formed at the foot of the retreating ice, filled with silt and floating blocks of ice that cracked like thunder as they broke apart. Rivers burst their banks, carving new courses through the moraines. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, Britain began to breathe again. When the ice withdrew, it left behind a scarred landscape, bare rock, sand and gravel, the debris of a continent rebuilt from scratch. The soil was gone. Forests would not return for centuries, yet into this empty world, life began to creep back. Mosses colonized the tundra first, followed by grasses and flowering plants. Reindeer and wild horses returned, grazing the first shoots of green across the grey plains. Then came the birds following the rivers north. Humans, however, were still far away, waiting for the world to warm just enough to make the journey possible again. By 12,000 years ago, small groups of Homo sapiens were living in northern France, watching the glaciers recede across the horizon. For them, Britain was not yet an island, only a distant extension of the land they knew. When they finally crossed into this thawing world, they would find a country utterly transformed, a place reborn from ice, waiting to be rediscovered. The last Ice Age reminds us that Britain's story is not only one of people, but of climate, of disappearance and return, of creation through destruction. The land we know today is built on the ruins of ancient ice, its rivers carved by meltwater, its soils formed from glacial dust. Every hill and valley carries the shape of that forgotten world, and perhaps the deeper lesson is that our species has always been temporary here. For nearly 1 million years, humans have come and gone with the rhythm of the ice, leaving only traces before retreating again. Each return feels permanent, but none ever is. Imagine the sound of water after thousands of years of silence. Ice cracks like thunder. Rivers surge through valleys that have been locked in frost for millennia, and the air, for the first time in an age, smells of soil. Around 12,000 years ago, the world began to change in ways that must have felt like the turning of time itself. The Ice Age that had defined Britain for tens of thousands of years was ending. What had been a land of glaciers and mammoth steppe was now waking into something new. A rebirth so slow, yet so complete, that every living thing would have to learn how to exist again. At first, it began with warmth. Not much, but enough. The glaciers that had once buried Scotland and northern England began to withdraw, leaving behind raw, barren ground. Meltwater rivers carved deep channels through the moraines, filling the old valleys with torrents of silt-laden water. Lakes formed where ice once sat unmoving. The retreat of the British-Irish ice sheet marked one of the most dramatic environmental transformations in the planet's history. Within a few thousand years, the cold, treeless tundra of Britain turned into a living mosaic of lakes, meadows, and new forests. The climate, though still unstable, was shifting toward the modern Holocene, the warmer interglacial epoch that continues today. As the atmosphere warmed, plant life began to recolonize the land from the south. Seeds carried by wind, birds and rivers took root in the glacial dust. First came mosses and hardy grasses, then shrubs, followed by birch and willow. Over the centuries, these pioneers paved the way for larger forests of pine, hazel and oak. Britain was greening, and with every patch of green came movement, animals returning to reclaim the empty space. The great herds of reindeer that had once roamed across the mammoth steppe now followed the retreating cold northward, leaving behind a changing cast of species. Red deer and wild cattle replaced them, while boar rooted through the new undergrowth. Wolves and brown bears followed, reclaiming the forests. Lynx crept through the shadows. Across what had once been permafrost, the chorus of insects, frogs and birds returned. Even the rivers came alive again, filling with salmon and trout migrating upstream into the newly thawed highlands. Britain, once a frozen wilderness, had become one of the richest environments in Europe, yet this transformation came with immense volatility. Around 12,800 years ago, the warming suddenly faltered. The planet plunged back into a brief but violent cold spell known as the Younger Dryas. For 1,000 years, glaciers advanced once more across northern Britain. Forests withered, animals migrated south, and the fragile warmth seemed lost. Then, just as abruptly, around 11,700 years ago, the cold ended. The final pulse of the Ice Age broke, and the Holocene began. From that moment on, the planet entered a new equilibrium. Temperatures rose rapidly, stabilizing to levels similar to our own. Forests spread like fire across the continent. In a matter of centuries, the tree line pushed northward hundreds of kilometres. By 10,000 years ago, much of Britain was covered in dense woodland, a world of oaks, elms and hazel groves, threaded with clear rivers and quiet marshes. The ice was gone. The tundra was gone. What remained was a world that would feel strangely familiar to modern eyes. And then the people returned. The re-entry of humans into post-glacial Britain marked not just a recolonisation, but a resurrection. After more than 10,000 years of absence, Homo sapiens came north again, descendants of the same species that had once walked here during earlier warm phases. Their origins likely lay in southern France or Iberia, where refugees of warmth had allowed small hunter-gatherer populations to survive the cold. As the ice retreated, these groups followed the rivers and the herds northward, exploring the thawing plains that connected Europe and Britain through the still dry lands of Doggerland. What they found was a landscape unlike anything their ancestors had known. The open steppe had transformed into a world of deep forests and wetlands. Hunting strategies changed with it. Instead of mammoths and reindeer, people hunted red deer, wild cattle and boar. Instead of throwing spears across the open tundra, they crafted smaller, more precise tools designed for close tracking in woodland environments. These were the first Mesolithic people of Britain, forest hunters, fishers and foragers who would spend the next few thousand years shaping their lives around the new rhythm of the Holocene. One of the earliest known traces of their presence comes from Starcar, near what is now Scarborough in North Yorkshire. Around 11,000 years ago, a small community lived beside a vast lake there, leaving behind an extraordinary archaeological record of early Holocene life. Excavations revealed flint tools, wooden platforms, and even antler headdresses, perhaps worn in ritual or as disguise during hunting. Here, in the damp edges of a post-glacial lake, humans were re-establishing their relationship with this reborn land. But before Starcar, before settlements and tools, there must have been the first arrivals, small groups moving cautiously into the thawing wilderness. They would have seen landscapes in transition, valleys filled with glacial lakes, slopes covered in newly sprouted birch, and the carcasses of ice left stranded in the sun. To live in such a world required constant adaptation. Rivers that had been dry one year might flood the next. valleys might vanish beneath lakes or marshes. Yet these people endured, guided by the same survival instinct that had carried humans through every ice age before. For scientists, the evidence of this transition comes not only from archaeology, but from nature's archives. Pollen cores extracted from ancient peat bogs and lake sediments reveal, layer by layer, the exact sequence of plant life's return. The fingerprints of warming, a shift from tundra herbs to shrubs, then to trees, can be read in microscopic detail. Each pollen grain, preserved in mud for 10,000 years, tells a story of resilience and renewal. Animal bones, too, mark the unfolding recovery. Fossil evidence from caves and river valleys shows the northward migration of species as the climate warmed. Elk, beaver and aurochs returned first, followed by predators. The balance of this ecosystem was delicate but stable, a tapestry of life reweaving itself across the scars of the ice. Even the soil began to heal. Where glaciers had scraped the land bare, wind-blown dust and decaying vegetation formed new, fertile layers. The very ground of Britain was being rebuilt from the debris of its own destruction. To imagine the sensory world of that time is to picture contrasts. Days lengthening, the air rich with new smells, pine resin, wet earth, and the musk of animals. The calls of birds returning to lakes that had been silent for ages. The rhythmic crash of meltwater pouring into rivers. It was a world of sound after centuries of stillness. For the first humans who saw it, the transformation must have felt like a kind of revelation, a world alive again, untamed and vast. Yet even this rebirth carried reminders of impermanence. The forest that spread across Britain grew on unstable ground. The weight of the former ice sheets had pressed the land downward, and as they melted, the crust began to rise again, a slow geological rebound that continues to this day. Meanwhile, the southern coast sank as sea levels rose worldwide from the melting of continental glaciers. The very act of rebirth was already reshaping Britain's future borders. In time, the sea would begin to creep across the lowlands, cutting the island off from the continent. But for now, it remained connected, a single great realm of forest, river and life. What ended the Ice Age was more than climate, it was balance. The Earth's orbit shifted into a pattern that stabilized global temperatures, allowing ecosystems to mature rather than collapse. Britain, once a frozen outpost, became a refuge of abundance, and through that abundance, a new relationship formed between people and place. No longer mere survivors of a hostile age, humans in post-glacial Britain became part of a living system, hunting, gathering, burning, and shaping the land in small but meaningful ways. If one could stand on a hill in southern England 10,000 years ago and look across the horizon, the sight would feel like stepping into an untouched paradise. Herds of red deer grazed in glades of oak and birch. Rivers shimmered through wetlands thick with reeds and fish. Beavers dammed streams beneath the shadow of pines. Wolves hunted silently in the twilight, and somewhere a thin line of smoke rose from a distant camp, the signal that humans had returned once more to the island that would, one day, bear their story. The Great Melt was not just a geological event, it was the moment Britain was born anew. Everything that would follow, its forests, its rivers, its animals, its people, emerged from this slow thawing of time. And though the ice has long since vanished, its memory remains in the contours of the land and in the resilience of the life that came after it. The end of an ice age, it seems, does not feel like an ending at all. It feels like the beginning of everything. Imagine walking across a meadow that no longer exists, a place where rivers once wound through marshes, where deer left their tracks in soft earth, and where the air smelled of pine and salt. You look out across the horizon and see nothing but water, Yet somewhere beneath those grey waves lies a world that once joined Britain to the continent, a drowned country called Doggerland. Between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, it vanished. Not in a single day, not with one cataclysm, but through centuries of quiet drowning. The sea rose inch by inch, year by year, until the world the first Britons had known simply faded beneath the tide. At the beginning of this story, the island we now call Britain was not yet an island at all. When the great ice sheets began to melt after the last glacial maximum, sea levels were more than 100 metres lower than today. What is now the North Sea was then an enormous plain, a low-lying expanse of grassland, lakes and rivers that connected eastern Britain to northern Europe. Doggerland stretched from the cliffs of Norfolk all the way to the Dutch coast, a continent within a continent. It was not empty. Across this fertile landscape lived herds of red deer, aurochs, elk and wild horses, followed by wolves and humans who hunted them. The Mesolithic people who lived there fished its rivers, gathered shellfish from its shores, and built their camps among willow and alder trees. For them, the world did not end at the horizon, it continued across it. But the ice had not finished its work. As the Holocene warmed, the great glaciers of North America and Scandinavia continued to melt, releasing unimaginable volumes of water into the oceans. Every generation the shoreline crept further inland. Forests that once grew on dry ground became swamps. Valleys that once held villages became inlets of the sea. For the people living there, the change would have been slow enough to adapt to, but relentless enough to never escape. Their world was shrinking tide by tide. Around 9,000 years ago, Doggerland was still vast, though already smaller than it had been. Archaeological reconstructions suggest a landscape of rolling hills, marshes, and braided river systems. The ancient rivers of the Thames, Rhine, and Elbe once joined here, merging into a great waterway that flowed north into what would become the North Sea. It was, in many ways, one of the richest environments in prehistoric Europe, a temperate refuge filled with game, fish, and edible plants. We know this not from ruins or bones found on land, but from sediments dredged up accidentally by fishing trawlers and oil rigs. Beneath the North Sea, cores of ancient peat and clay still hold the pollen of those lost forests. Pieces of antler, mammoth bone and stone tools have been brought up in nets, each fragment a whisper from a vanished world. Then, about 8,200 years ago, something happened that turned the slow drowning into a sudden catastrophe. Off the coast of Norway, a massive section of the continental shelf, thousands of cubic kilometres of rock and mud, collapsed into the deep ocean. This event, known today as the Storegga Slide, was one of the largest underwater landslides in Earth's history. It triggered a tsunami that raced across the North Atlantic, sending waves towering over 20 metres high, crashing into the coasts of Scotland and the Shetland Islands. In low-lying Doggerland, the flood would have been devastating. Entire valleys may have vanished in a single day. Forests were uprooted, camps washed away, and estuaries reshaped forever. The people who survived would have seen the land itself withdraw, leaving behind only the sea's endless reach. We cannot know exactly how many lived there or what they called their home, but evidence suggests Doggerland supported thousands of people at its peak. By 8,000 years ago, though, the rising waters and repeated floods had transformed much of it into a scattered archipelago of small islands and wetlands. The Great Plain was breaking apart. Eventually, around 8,000 years before the present, the final connection between Britain and mainland Europe was severed. What had once been a bridge became a gulf. Britain was now an island. The separation was not merely geographical. It marked the beginning of a distinct human story, one in which isolation would shape culture, language, and identity for millennia to come. But for the people who lived through it, the event was not a symbol. It was loss. Their hunting grounds had disappeared. Routes they had walked for generations now lay beneath the sea. If oral traditions or mythic memories of this catastrophe ever survived, they are long since lost. But some researchers speculate that ancient flood stories passed down through generations might echo events like these, memories of real drownings, real migrations, real grief. Doggerland's disappearance was not an isolated event. Across the world, coastlines were changing as the last ice sheets melted. The Black Sea flooded, the Persian Gulf filled, and entire archipelagos appeared in Southeast Asia, where once there had been dry land. Humanity was experiencing a global shift in geography, a redefinition of the map itself. For the people of Mesolithic Europe, the ocean was not yet a stable thing. It was a moving boundary between past and present, between safety and loss. What makes Doggerland unique is how recently it was lost, and how well it was preserved. Beneath the North Sea, the seabed acts like a time capsule. Sediment cores show traces of ancient vegetation, preserved pollen, and DNA fragments from the plants and animals that once thrived there. Using techniques like marine geophysics and seismic mapping, scientists have been able to reconstruct its hills and valleys in astonishing detail. In digital models, Doggerland appears almost alive again, a living landscape frozen in memory. The rivers are still there, just buried under meters of sand and salt water. Yet the sea continues to hide more. Every year, trawlers bring up bones of bison, aurochs, and even humans, polished smooth by thousands of years underwater. In one remarkable case, a fragment of human skull dredged from the Brown Bank area of the North Sea was radiocarbon dated to over 8,000 years old, one of the last known inhabitants of the drowned land. Tools made of flint and antler found nearby suggest that even as the waters rose, people adapted, fishing, building canoes, and perhaps moving seasonally between the remaining high ground. It is tempting to imagine Doggerland as a kind of lost paradise, Europe's own Atlantis, but the truth was likely far more ordinary and more human. It was not a single civilization, but a patchwork of small communities bound by river systems and trade. People here were foragers, not farmers. They lived by the tides, followed animal migrations, and built lives around what the land offered. Their disappearance was not dramatic conquest or sudden ruin. It was the quiet retreat of humanity before a force too large to stop. For Britain itself, the separation marked a profound ecological turning point. As the sea advanced, marine environments replaced wetlands. Fish species like cod, herring and mackerel spread into the new North Sea. The changing climate and geography reshaped migration routes for both animals and people. Forests thickened, rivers stabilized, and the island began to take on its familiar outlines. The geological process known as isostatic rebound, the land rising after the weight of the ice was removed, caused parts of Scotland to lift while southern England slowly tilted downward, allowing seawater to invade the lowlands even more deeply. Nature was still sculpting the island's identity. From a distance of 10,000 years, it is easy to think of the flooding of Doggerland as a single event. In reality, it was a drawn-out, uneven process, part catastrophe, part adaptation. People likely moved gradually, retreating inland as the waters advanced, resettling on higher ground in what is now eastern England and southern Scandinavia. For every family that perished in the floods, there were others who found new lives along the coasts that replaced the plains. Survival, as always, meant movement, and yet something of that old connection never quite vanished. For thousands of years after the final separation, trade and contact between Britain and the continent continued across the narrow seas. Stone tools, animal hides, and even cultural ideas crossed the channel by boat. The island may have been cut off, but it was never alone. The same rising waters that ended one world quietly laid the foundation for the next. The beginning of Britain's long independent story. Standing on the shore of the North Sea today, it is hard to imagine the land that lies beneath it. The waves roll in endlessly, hiding valleys that once echoed with the sound of human voices. Somewhere out there, beneath 40 metres of water, lie the ghosts of rivers, the shadows of trees, and perhaps the footprints of those who fled the final tide. Doggerland reminds us that the landscapes we think of as permanent are anything but. Every coast is temporary, every border fluid. The sea that erased the first bridge to Europe will, given enough time, erase the edges of the island itself. And so, when we look out across that water, we're really looking into deep time, into a story still unfolding. The question is not just how Doggerland was lost, but how we remember what was taken. Because in the end, every civilization lives on borrowed land, and every map we draw is only a moment before the tide. Imagine a world where Britain is one endless forest. No farms, no villages, no cleared fields or fences. Just trees stretching from horizon to horizon. The air is thick with the smell of pine and earth. Wolves move silently between the trunks. Red deer graze in the shadows, and on the banks of quiet lakes, thin trails of smoke rise from human camps. This is Britain around 8,000 years before the present, deep in the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, when the island was still young and wild. Every sound meant something. Every movement in the leaves might be food, danger, or a spirit. The Ice Age had been over for millennia, and Britain had settled into its Holocene calm. The land was warmer and wetter than it had ever been. Oak, hazel, birch and elm covered almost every corner of the island, broken only by rivers, lakes and bogs. The coastlines were still adjusting after the Great Melt. Estuaries expanded, islands formed, and rivers cut new paths through the thickening woods. In this vast forest, small bands of hunter-gatherers, perhaps no more than 20 or 30 people at a time, made their homes. They were the descendants of those who had returned to Britain as the glaciers retreated, the first fully modern humans to live continuously in this reborn land. For centuries they left little trace beyond the faint marks of their tools and fires. But at certain places the past holds still. One such place is Starcar, a quiet lakeshore in what is now North Yorkshire. Discovered in the middle of the 20th century, it remains one of the most extraordinary windows into early human life anywhere in the world. Around 11,000 years ago, when Starcar was still a vast lake surrounded by marsh and birch woodland, a small community lived along its edges. They built wooden platforms over the water and hunted red deer in the surrounding forest. Excavations revealed the remains of their tools, ornaments, and hearths, perfectly preserved in the peat, as if time itself had decided to remember them. What makes Starcar remarkable is not just its preservation, but what it tells us about the minds of the people who lived there. Among the finds were more than 20 red deer skulls, carefully modified with holes drilled through the craniums and antlers trimmed. Archaeologists believe these may have been worn as headdresses, perhaps during rituals or hunts. To wear the face of a deer is to see through its eyes, a moment of transformation between human and animal. Whether this was meant as camouflage, ceremony, or something deeper, we cannot be sure. But it speaks to a way of life in which survival and symbolism were intertwined. The people of the Mesolithic were not primitive wanderers. They understood their world intimately. Each tool, each fire, each path through the forest was shaped by generations of observation and adaptation. They made weapons from flint so fine that the edges could cut skin like glass. Tiny stone blades called microliths, set into wooden shafts with resin to create lightweight, flexible arrows. These allowed them to hunt fast-moving prey like deer, boar and birds with precision. They built canoes from hollowed logs to fish the rivers and cross lakes. Bone points, antler picks, and barbed harpoons reveal a technological creativity as sophisticated in its own way as the engineers of later ages. Fire was their constant companion. It provided warmth, light, and protection, but also control. By burning sections of forest, these early Britons could encourage the growth of plants that attracted animals, creating open glades ideal for hunting. Charcoal layers across ancient soils suggest that fire was used deliberately to shape the landscape, a kind of low-intensity management long before the invention of agriculture. To them, the forest was not wilderness. It was a living system they knew how to guide. Life in Mesolithic Britain followed the rhythms of the seasons. In spring, people might move toward the coast to fish and gather shellfish. Summer meant inland hunting and berry gathering, while winter drove them to sheltered valleys, where they built temporary huts from branches, hides and turf. Their homes were small, circular and warm, spaces for cooking, crafting and storytelling by firelight. Within these circles, knowledge was passed down: where to find flint, how to read animal tracks, which plants could heal or harm. Memory was their library. Every hill, river and tree had a name, a story, or a warning attached to it. From the fragments of bone and charcoal they left behind, we can piece together their diet and habits. Red deer and wild boar were staples, but they also caught fish like pike and salmon, and collected nuts, roots and berries. They used every part of the animals they hunted: bones for tools, sinew for binding, hides for clothing and shelter. Nothing was wasted. This balance between need and restraint defined their relationship with the world. In the Mesolithic, survival was not domination, but participation, and yet, even in this deep forest, they were not alone. Britain's ecosystems teemed with life far beyond human control. Lynx, bears, and wolves still hunted freely. Beavers built dams in every stream. In the shallows of the rivers swam enormous sturgeon. It was a land of abundance, but also uncertainty. Storms could fell forests. Disease could decimate herds. A fire, once lit, could burn for days through dry woodlands. To live here was to exist in constant negotiation with nature. There was also art, though not the painted caves of Ice Age France, but subtler traces of meaning. At Starkar, beads made from shale and amber hint at adornment and trade. One find, a perforated deer tooth worn as a pendant, may have held personal or spiritual value. Elsewhere in Mesolithic Britain, engraved stones and abstract patterns have been found, lines and marks whose purpose remains elusive. Perhaps they were maps, symbols, or simple expressions of presence. We were here. Even in death, the Mesolithic people reveal thoughtfulness. Burial sites from this era are rare, but those discovered show care in how bodies were laid to rest, sometimes accompanied by tools, ornaments, or red ochre. This suggests a belief, however simple, in continuity beyond life. The same imagination that turned antlers into headdresses and trees into shelters also turned mortality into meaning. The climate of this era remained relatively stable, though the landscape continued to evolve. Sea levels rose further, finalising Britain's separation from the continent and shaping new coastlines. Inland, rivers meandered through vast floodplains, feeding the marshes and lakes that sustained human life. The dense forests muffled sound, creating a world that was both intimate and immense. Archaeologists call this the wildwood, a term that captures not chaos but living order. It is easy to imagine these people as isolated, but evidence suggests they were connected across vast distances. The flint found at Starkar likely came from sources over 100 kilometres away. Pieces of amber from the Baltic hint at exchange networks that spanned regions. Even at the scale of small bands, there were pathways of trade, migration and communication linking groups across the island and beyond. When we picture Mesolithic life, it is tempting to see simplicity. But simplicity is not the same as ignorance. These were people who knew the sky, the tides, and the calls of birds. They read the seasons in the shape of leaves and the movement of fish. They understood that everything alive had patterns, and that to survive, one had to listen. Their intelligence was ecological, not mechanical, quiet rather than declarative. To stand at Starkar today is to feel the echo of that intelligence. The lake is gone, long filled in and reclaimed by fields, but beneath the soil lies the memory of campfires, footprints, and the faint scent of pine smoke. The tools they left behind are small, almost delicate, yet they tell a story of endurance that lasted thousands of years. For these forest people, time moved not in centuries but in cycles. The return of deer, the fall of leaves, the coming of frost. Every year was both an ending and a beginning. By around 7,000 years ago, the way of life these people had known was at its height. The island was covered in woodland, and human groups had adapted perfectly to its rhythms. But slowly things began to change. The climate grew wetter, the forests denser, and the balance between land and people began to shift. Across the seas to the east and south, new ideas were emerging, ideas that would soon reach these shores. Farming, settlement and ownership would transform this relationship forever. For now, though, Mesolithic Britain remains one of history's most peaceful eras, an age defined not by monuments or empires, but by attention. Its people left no palaces, only flint and firelight, yet they lived in harmony with the living world in ways we're only beginning to understand. In their quiet resilience, they remind us that civilization did not begin with cities. It began with understanding where you are. Imagine a forest clearing. The smell of damp earth rises after rain, and a woman kneels in the soil, pressing small grains into the ground. Around her, the air hums with insects and the crackle of a distant fire. She doesn't know it yet, but what she's doing will change Britain and the human story forever. Around 4,000 years before the Common Era, this was how the Neolithic began on the island. Quietly, patiently, seed by seed. The age of the hunter was ending. The age of the farmer had begun. For nearly 4,000 years, people in Britain had lived as hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, following the rhythms of the forest. Then, suddenly, by archaeological standards, everything shifted. The tools, the food, the homes, even the dead, all changed. In place of scattered camps came permanent settlements. In place of wild forests came fields. People began to shape the landscape not through fire and hunt, but through cultivation. The shift was so profound that archaeologists call it the Neolithic Revolution. But in Britain, it wasn't a simple revolution. It was a negotiation between old ways and new ones. The first farmers did not invent agriculture themselves. The idea had arrived from far away, from the warm valleys of the Near East, where wild wheat and barley were first domesticated nearly 6,000 years earlier. Over generations, farming spread slowly across Europe, following the rivers and coastlines as communities carried with them their animals, seeds and knowledge. By the time this way of life reached Britain, around 4,000 years before the Common Era, it had already transformed much of the continent. Yet Britain's forests and coasts were still home to the descendants of Mesolithic foragers, people who had never known life without movement or abundance. When farmers arrived, they met not an empty island, but one already deeply inhabited. For decades, archaeologists debated how farming reached Britain. Was it through migration, new people bringing new ways, or through the gradual adoption of ideas by the existing hunter-gatherers? Recent genetic studies have begun to tilt the answer. The DNA of early Neolithic Britons shows strong connections to populations from the continent, particularly from areas that are now France and the Low Countries. This suggests that small groups of farmers crossed the Channel, perhaps by boat, bringing with them domesticated animals, seeds and tools. They did not conquer, they mingled. The result was not replacement but blending, old blood learning new habits. Their arrival coincided with the first great clearings of Britain's forests. Using polished stone axes, people began to cut down trees to open land for crops and grazing. The tools themselves were marvels of craftsmanship, jadeite blades polished to a mirror sheen, sometimes imported from the distant Alps. These were not just instruments of work, they were symbols of connection and prestige. To cut a tree with such a tool must have felt like an act of both power and ceremony. The land for the first time was being claimed, defined and reshaped by human will. The earliest farms were modest. People planted wheat and barley, tended small plots and raised animals, cattle, pigs, sheep and goats. They built long rectangular houses from timber and thatch, clustered in small communities near rivers or on fertile lowlands. Life was still seasonal, but now it turned around the demands of the soil. Sowing in spring, harvesting in autumn, storing for winter. This new relationship with time changed everything. The future could now be planned, and failure could be measured in months, not moments. Archaeologists can trace the spread of these communities through their monuments, the long barrows and chambered tombs that began to appear across the landscape soon after farming took root. The most famous are found in places like West Kennet, Bellas Knap and Wayland's Smithy. These were great communal burial mounds, built of earth and stone, where generations of families were laid to rest together. Inside, bones were carefully arranged, skulls separated from limbs, sometimes reburied or rearranged over time. These structures were not simply graves, they were statements, a way of anchoring the living to the land by rooting their dead within it. To farm a field was to make a claim. To bury your ancestors beneath it was to make that claim eternal. Such monuments reveal something else, the emergence of memory as architecture. Where Mesolithic people had lived in cycles of movement, the farmers of the Neolithic began to build permanence. They left markers across the hills and valleys, cairns, causeways and mounds, each one a reminder that this land was now theirs. This shift from temporary camp to permanent place was more than practical. It was psychological. Humans were beginning to see themselves not as part of the landscape, but as its stewards. But farming brought risks that foraging never had. The success of a harvest depended on weather, soil and luck. A poor year could mean famine. Diseases spread more easily when people and animals lived closely together. The diet narrowed. Where foragers had eaten dozens of species of plants and animals, early farmers relied mostly on grain and livestock. Yet the trade-off was stability. With food stored, populations could grow. Children no longer had to be carried through forests or across mountains. They could be raised in one place. And so, communities expanded slowly but steadily. The archaeological record of this era is rich with signs of this transformation. Animal bones show clear evidence of domestication. Cattle bred smaller, pigs more docile, and sheep adapted for wool rather than wild survival. Pottery appears for the first time in Britain, simple but functional, used for cooking, storage and trade. The creation of pots marks another turning point in human thought, the concept of containment, of keeping the fruits of labour for later. It's a small detail, but one that echoes across human history. In the stillness of the Neolithic, we also glimpse the birth of community identity. Villages began to develop their own styles of tools and decoration. In Orkney, in the far north, entire stone-built settlements would eventually rise, Skara Brae among them. But even in the south, the patterns of daily life were changing. Fires no longer marked temporary camps but central hearths. Songs and stories began to attach themselves not to journeys but to places. The land itself became part of the human imagination. One of the most revealing sites of this early farming period lies in southern England, the Sweet Track near Glastonbury, a timber walkway built over wetlands around 3,800 years before the Common Era. Made of planks laid carefully over swampy ground, it connected dry islands across a vast bog. To build it required cooperation, planning, and engineering skill. But more than that, it speaks of belonging. People were no longer merely crossing the land, they were maintaining it, improving it, committing to it. The forests that had once defined Britain were slowly giving way to open fields and pasture. Fire was used again, this time not for hunting, but for clearing. The landscape began to take on the patchwork of light and shadow that still defines rural Britain today. Clearings, hedges, and lines of trees separating one field from another. The wildwood was retreating, and with it, the old way of life. Yet traces of that older world persisted. In some places, hunter-gatherer traditions endured for centuries, overlapping with farming communities. Flint tools continued to be made, deer continued to be hunted, and ancient forests remained sacred. This blending of old and new gave rise to a unique culture. Neither purely Mesolithic nor fully Neolithic, something in between. Britain's first farmers were not conquerors of nature, but its new collaborators. Their worldview likely reflected that balance. The same reverence once held for the forest spirits and animal totems now extended to the earth itself, to the soil, the sun, and the cycles of growth. To plant a seed was not merely work, it was ritual. The act tied humans to the same pattern they had once only observed. Life and death were now measured in harvests. By the middle of the third millennium before the Common Era, the foundations of Britain's future were in place. People had built homes, cleared fields, and buried their dead in monuments that would outlast them by millennia. Their animals grazed the same valleys that had once echoed with mammoths and wolves, and though they could not have known it, the choices they made to stay, to plant, to build would define everything that came after. From these first seeds grew not just crops, but culture. Farming gave birth to permanence, to ownership, to the first outlines of society as we know it. And yet, if you listen closely to the soil of those old clearings, you might still hear the forest breathing underneath, a reminder that before humans shaped Britain, the land shaped them. Imagine the sound of stones moving, not rolling freely but dragged, inch by inch, across a wet chalk plain. Wooden sleds creak under the weight. The air smells of sweat, soil and rain. Hundreds of people pull together, barefoot and synchronized, their hands wrapped around ropes made from twisted bark. Above them rises a circle that will outlive them all. They are not building for shelter, they are building for time itself. This was Britain around 2,800 years before the Common Era, the dawn of the Age of Monuments. For thousands of years, humans had lived close to the land, planting, herding and burying their dead in long barrows and cairns. But during the late Neolithic, something changed. The people of Britain began to gather not to survive but to remember. A across the island, enormous stone and timber structures appeared, each one different yet sharing a common rhythm. Circular, astronomical, and impossibly precise. None captured that transformation more completely than Stonehenge. To stand before Stonehenge today is to face a mystery wrapped in silence. Its great sarsen stones, some weighing more than 40 tons, still trace the circle begun nearly 5,000 years ago. Around them lie older rings of smaller bluestones, transported over 200 kilometres from the Preseli Hills of Wales. The monument was not built at once but evolved through centuries, each generation adding, shifting or reinterpreting its meaning. What survives is not a single act of creation, but a dialogue across time, a conversation between builders who never met but shared a vision of alignment, ritual and belonging. The engineering behind it is astonishing even by modern standards. Moving a single sarsen block would have required the strength of hundreds of people and ingenious coordination. Archaeologists believe they used wooden rollers, ropes of twisted hide or fibre, and sledges pulled over greased tracks. To raise the upright stones, they likely dug deep pits, tilted each block upright, and packed it with chalk and rubble, before levering the lintels into place using earth ramps. These were farmers, not engineers, yet the precision of their work suggests deep planning and communal effort. Each joint between the great stones was carved with mortise and tenon fittings, carpentry techniques translated into stone, proof that the builders combined craftsmanship with cosmic ambition. But why build it at all? The question has filled libraries, and yet the answer remains partly hidden in the soil. Stonehenge was not an isolated structure. It was part of a vast ritual landscape that stretched across southern Britain. Within a few kilometres lay Durrington Walls, a massive timber circle and settlement where thousands of people once gathered seasonally. Animal bones found there bear cut marks suggesting large-scale feasting. Pigs and cattle cooked and shared in great numbers. It was a place of celebration, perhaps at midsummer and midwinter, when the sun stood still on the horizon. The alignment of Stonehenge itself, with the sunrise of the summer solstice and the sunset of the winter, points to a culture that measured life not by days, but by celestial rhythm. Time for them was sacred geography. Each stone then was a kind of instrument, a marker for the turning of the earth and the renewal of the seasons. The people who gathered there were not merely watching the sky, they were binding themselves to it. The circular form of Stonehenge echoed the cycles of the sun, the moon, and life itself. In an age before writing, this was their calendar, their temple, and perhaps even their storybook carved into the landscape. The scale of the project reveals something even larger: organisation. Thousands of people must have contributed, quarrying, transporting, feeding the workers, and maintaining the site over generations. This required leadership, coordination, and shared belief. Whether that leadership was spiritual or practical, we cannot know, but it suggests that late Neolithic society in Britain was far from primitive. These were people who could plan over lifetimes, who understood logistics and geometry, who believed that labour could create meaning beyond survival. The monument also reflects connections across Britain and beyond. The smaller bluestones from Wales prove that ideas, and perhaps people, travelled long distances. Isotopic analysis of animal bones from Durrington Walls shows that some came from as far as the Scottish Highlands. Stonehenge was not a local project. It was a gathering point for the island itself, perhaps a kind of pilgrimage centre, long before the concept of pilgrimage existed. The movement of goods, animals and people across such distances implies trade, communication, and a shared spiritual language. Even the surrounding landscape seems designed to participate in this ritual topography. Processional avenues link Stonehenge to the River Avon, whose waters reflect the sun during solstice dawns. Timber circles once mirrored the stone ones, the living wood of Durrington for the world of the living, and the enduring stone of Stonehenge for the realm of the ancestors. Between them, the river may have symbolised the passage between life and death, a sacred geography inscribed into the land itself. It is tempting to imagine Stonehenge as a solitary marvel, but in truth it was one of many. Across Britain and Ireland other great circles rose, Avebury with its vast double ring of stones, Callanish aligned to the moon's extreme rise and set, and countless smaller henges, barrows and cursus monuments. Each was unique, yet together they formed a network of belief and connection. The builders of these monuments were not isolated tribes, they were participants in a shared Neolithic world that stretched across the Atlantic seaboard of Europe. Stonehenge, however, endures as its most haunting symbol because it captures a paradox. Built at the height of the Neolithic farming world, it already carries the melancholy of change. The people who raised its stones were nearing the end of their era. Within a few centuries, bronze would arrive, metal would replace stone, and the societies that built the henges would fade. Perhaps they sensed it already, the slow turning of an age. Some archaeologists believe the final phases of Stonehenge's construction were acts of remembrance, not renewal. The stones stood not for what was coming, but for what was passing away. Even today the monument speaks with that quiet power. It is not the architecture of domination, but of patience. To stand beneath those lintels is to feel time condensed, human effort made geological. The builders were ordinary people, farmers, herders, craftspeople. They built with bone tools and ropes, yet their work captured the sky. The stones record not gods, but questions about death, about return, about why the sun always rises where it does. The more we uncover, the more we realise how little we truly know. Excavations around the site continue to reveal pits, burials and alignments that challenge earlier theories. Was it a healing centre, as some bones suggest? Was it an ancestral gathering ground, a place where the living met the dead each solstice to renew their pact with time? Or was it simply a gathering of wonder, a human attempt to make sense of the seasons that ruled their survival? What is certain is that Stonehenge was never static. Its meaning evolved with its people. As centuries passed, some stones were moved, others re-erected, others toppled. Fires burned around it, ashes scattered, offerings buried. Even after its builders were gone, later cultures returned to it, drawn by something beyond explanation. The stones became a constant in a world that refused to stay still. To think of Stonehenge as a monument to eternity misses its true nature. It is a monument to motion, of stars, of people, of time itself. It teaches quietly that permanence is an illusion, and that what truly lasts is the rhythm of return. Perhaps that is why it still feels alive. The solstice sun still rises over the heelstone, just as it did 5,000 years ago, cutting a shaft of light through the ancient circle. The same moment that once drew the farmers of the Neolithic now draws crowds of modern travellers, all seeking the same thing, to feel, if only for a heartbeat, aligned with the world again. The builders of Stonehenge are gone, but their logic remains written in shadow and sunrise. They understood something we keep forgetting, that to measure time is to participate in it. And as the light touches those old stones each year, the circle begins again, and their question lingers across the ages. How long can meaning last if no one remembers to look up? Imagine holding a piece of stone and feeling the cold, dull surface that has shaped your entire world. Now imagine seeing for the first time a metal that gleams like sunlight trapped in solid form. It bends, it cuts, it lasts. Around 2,000 years before the Common Era, that moment arrived in Britain, and it changed everything. The Age of Stone gave way to an age of ambition. From quiet farming communities emerged warriors, traders, and kings, and all of it began with fire, copper, and tin. Britain's Bronze Age began when travellers from the continent brought a knowledge that seemed almost alchemical: how to smelt copper and mix it with tin to make bronze. It was a discovery that unified chemistry and craft, turning geology into power. For thousands of years, the island's people had shaped flint and bone, living within limits set by the materials of their world. Bronze shattered those limits. It was stronger, sharper, and more enduring than anything that came before, and in that difference lay the seed of inequality. Whoever controlled metal controlled destiny. One of the most haunting clues to this transition lies in a grave near Stonehenge, discovered in the early 21st century. The man buried there became known as the Amesbury Archer. He was interred around 2,300 years before the Common Era, long after the stones had fallen silent. His grave held an extraordinary wealth of goods: finely made arrowheads, copper knives, gold ornaments, and wrist guards for archery. Isotope analysis of his teeth revealed that he was not local. He had grown up in the Alpine region of Central Europe. He had travelled hundreds of kilometres to reach Britain, bringing with him the technology of metal and perhaps the prestige that came with it. His was a life and death, lived at the intersection of two worlds: the old stone-working farmers and the new metal-bearing elites. The archer's burial marks a turning point. Before him, wealth was measured in land, livestock, and kin. After him, it gleamed in the earth. Metal became more than a material. It became a language of status. Bronze weapons and jewellery announced hierarchy in a way that stone never could. Chiefs and chieftains emerged, not because they were stronger farmers, but because they could command the flow of metal and through it the loyalty of others. Across Britain, graves from this period begin to show clear signs of rank. Some individuals were buried with weapons and ornaments, while others lay with none. Power for the first time could be displayed, accumulated, and inherited. The technology that fueled this transformation spread fast. At first, copper was imported from continental Europe, but soon the island's own mineral wealth came into play. Cornwall in the southwest was rich in tin, one of the rarest and most essential ingredients for bronze. Its mines became a magnet for trade, drawing merchants from distant lands. Archaeologists have found fragments of amber from the Baltic, beads from the Mediterranean, and designs on metalwork that echo patterns from Mycenaean Greece. Even this far edge of the known world was part of a network that reached from the Atlantic to the Aegean. Bronze made the world smaller and Britain richer. Alongside trade came art. Metal was not only functional, but beautiful. The people of Bronze Age Britain mastered techniques of casting, engraving, and inlaying. They created torques of twisted gold, dagger blades with intricate hilts, and ceremonial axes too ornate to ever be used in battle. Metal became a medium for storytelling. Spirals, curves, and solar motifs adorned tools and ornaments alike, suggesting a belief system deeply connected to the cycles of nature and the sun. Where earlier monuments like Stonehenge had linked people to the cosmos through architecture, bronze allowed them to carry that symbolism on their bodies. The world of faith was becoming portable, personal, and political. With wealth came war. The same bronze that crafted beauty also forged blades. Swords appear for the first time in Britain's archaeological record during this era. Weapons designed not for hunting, but for fighting other humans. Hilltops that once held ceremonial enclosures were now fortified with ramparts and ditches. The landscape began to divide into territories, each ruled by leaders who could defend and expand their domains. Trade routes needed guarding, power needed protecting. For the first time, Britain's story begins to resemble politics. Yet despite this new tension, Bronze Age society was not only violent, it was also cooperative. Mining, smelting and casting required specialised knowledge and collaboration. Communities worked together to sustain the flow of materials and maintain the furnaces that burned day and night. Metalworking became a profession, a priestly craft, both feared and revered. To watch stone melt into metal must have felt like witnessing the earth give birth. These smiths were, in a sense, magicians of their age. Their skills link the natural and the supernatural, their fires illuminating the boundary between survival and civilization. Ritual life, too, evolved alongside these technologies. The rivers of Britain, especially the Thames, became places of offering. Weapons, ornaments and tools were deliberately cast into the water, sacrificed to unseen powers. Archaeologists have recovered swords bent deliberately before being thrown into the current, a symbolic act of killing the weapon so it could live again in another realm. This practice suggests a deep belief in reciprocity between the human and the divine. If you give something precious to the world gives back. These rivers of sacrifice flowed parallel to rivers of trade, each carrying their own kind of wealth. Climate, as always, shaped the rhythm of life. During the Middle Bronze Age, the British climate was relatively warm and stable, allowing population growth and agricultural expansion. But around 1,200 years before the Common Era, conditions began to shift. Rainfall increased, and cooler temperatures made some highland farms unsustainable. Settlements moved downhill, trade routes changed, and wetlands expanded. The same weather that enriched the fields could also swallow them. Still, the networks of exchange endured, proof of a resilience rooted in adaptation. The social world of Bronze Age Britain remains a puzzle of contradictions. It was a time of progress and inequality, of connection and isolation. Coastal regions thrived through trade, while inland groups maintained older traditions. Some communities buried their dead in barrows, while others cremated them, scattering ashes across sacred landscapes. This diversity hints at a society flexible enough to absorb change without losing its identity, a balance that would define the island's future again and again. The closing centuries of the Bronze Age saw the first hints of something even more structured: proto-kingdoms. Large defended settlements, precursors to hillforts, appeared, and leaders began to consolidate control over broader territories. These early powers were sustained not only by force, but by prestige. Possession of exotic goods, amber, gold, imported tools, became symbols of authority. The leader was not merely a warrior, he was a node in a network of wealth that stretched beyond sight. In this sense, the birth of leadership was also the birth of dependence, on trade, on labour, and on the fragile promise that peace could last long enough for exchange to continue. One remarkable discovery that bridges the local and the global is the Rilleton Gold Cup, found in Cornwall and dated to around 1,700 years before the Common Era. Its elegant shape and fine craftsmanship mirror similar cups found in Mycenaean tombs in Greece. Whether it was imported or locally made in imitation, it tells us that the people of Bronze Age Britain were not isolated artisans in a misty corner of Europe. They were part of a shared world of ideas, style and status. By the end of the Bronze Age, around 700 years before the Common Era, the fires that had birthed kingdoms were cooling. Across Europe, iron was spreading, cheaper, stronger and more abundant than bronze. The old elites who had ruled through their control of tin and copper saw their advantage erode. Trade routes shifted. Power shifted with them. The world was about to change again, as it always does when a new material enters the human story. And yet, the legacy of the Bronze Age endures. It taught Britain how to organise, how to lead, how to imagine wealth beyond survival. It was the first time the island spoke to the wider world and was spoken back to. When you look at the shimmer of bronze artefacts today, dulled by time but still gleaming faintly under museum lights, you're looking at the first glimmer of civilization, the moment when humanity learned to shape not only tools, but hierarchy, belief, and identity itself. The stone gave way to metal, but the human hand remained the same, searching, shaping, and reaching toward meaning. Imagine a world where Britain is not yet England, a quilt of hillforts, tribes, and sacred groves, where smoke rises from wooden strongholds and oak trees are older than memory. The island hums with its own rhythm, far from the marble roads and marching legions of Rome. But one day, that rhythm will break. The wild island at the edge of the known world will be claimed by the greatest empire of its time, and in the space of a few centuries, everything that once defined prehistoric Britain will vanish into history. This is how it ended. Not with silence, but with the echo of drums, fire, and faith. By around 700 years before the Common Era, the Bronze Age had faded into the Iron Age. Across the island, communities began to build anew, not in stone circles or barrow tombs, but on hilltops. These hill forts, ringed by massive earthen ramparts and wooden palisades, dotted the landscape from Wessex to Wales, from the Chalk Downs to the Scottish borders. They were centres of trade, refuge, and identity, villages with status, power, and defence. Iron had transformed life. Unlike bronze, iron could be found almost anywhere. It democratised strength. Farmers could now plough tougher soils, warriors could forge sharper blades. The result was an age that was less about kings and more about clans. Power decentralised into hundreds of tribes, each carving out its own small kingdom in the fog and forest. These Iron Age societies were dynamic, not primitive. They farmed, traded, and crafted with skill. They minted coins in gold and silver, evidence of economic systems that predate Roman contact. They traded salt, wool, and metal with Gaul across the narrow sea. The people who lived here did not call themselves Celts. That was a name invented later. But they spoke related languages, shared similar art, and worshipped in similar ways. Their world was one of rhythm and ritual, bound to the seasons and the land. To them, rivers were gods, groves were temples, and time itself was a circle. At the heart of their spiritual world were the Druids, priestly figures, judges, philosophers, and keepers of oral knowledge. The Druids left no written words. Their wisdom lived only in speech and memory. To outsiders, especially later Roman writers, they seemed both mysterious and threatening, able to command thousands with nothing but words, and to interpret the will of the gods in the flight of birds or the pattern of stars. They presided over rituals in oak groves, where sacrifices, human or animal we do not know, were said to seal the bond between earth and sky. Yet what we do know is that they represented an intellectual class, a bridge between the material and spiritual worlds. In a society without writing, they were living libraries, repositories of science, law, and myth. Britain's tribes were many. In the south, the Atrebates and Catuvellauni. In the west, the Silures and the Ordovices. In the north, the Brigantes, who ruled vast lands between the Pennines and Hadrian's future wall. To the Romans, these divisions would later become convenient lines for conquest. But before the legions ever came, these tribes fought, traded, and married among themselves, bound by alliances that shifted with the wind. Some built monumental hill forts like Maiden Castle in Dorset. its concentric ramparts rising in sweeping curves over the chalk hills. Not just a fortress, but a statement of power and permanence. Others lived in open villages, trusting more in diplomacy than defence. The first shadows of Rome fell upon the island long before the legions themselves arrived. In the 1st century before the Common Era, traders and travellers from Gaul brought not only wine and olive oil, but stories. Stories of an empire that stretched across the known world, of roads and cities, laws and armies that could unmake nations. When Julius Caesar crossed the Channel in the year 55 before the Common Era, he did so less to conquer than to test the edge of the world. His invasion was brief, almost theatrical, a demonstration of Rome's reach. The Britons resisted fiercely, using chariots that darted across the battlefield like thunder. Caesar withdrew, leaving behind promises of tribute and alliances that soon faded. But he had opened a door that would never again close. For nearly a century the island remained free, connected to Rome through trade and curiosity, but not submission. Then, in the year 43 of the Common Era, Emperor Claudius ordered a full-scale invasion. 4 Roman legions, supported by auxiliaries and war elephants, landed in Kent. This time, they came not to explore but to stay. Within months, they had defeated several major tribes and established their first permanent settlements. Roman discipline met Celtic courage, and discipline won. The southern tribes, seeing which way the wind was blowing, allied themselves with Rome. Others resisted and were crushed. The conquest was not instant, nor total. It took decades. One of the most famous resistances came from a woman, Boudicca, queen of the Iceni tribe in eastern England. When her husband, a Roman client king, died, the Romans annexed his kingdom and humiliated her family. In response, she led one of the greatest revolts in ancient history. Around the year 61, her armies burned Roman settlements at Colchester, London and St Albans. The smoke of rebellion could be seen for miles. Yet her success was brief. The Roman general Suetonius Paulinus regrouped his forces and met Boudicca's army somewhere in the Midlands. Outnumbered but disciplined, the Roman legions held their line. When the battle ended, the Celtic forces lay dead, men, women and children alike. Boudicca, according to Roman sources, took her own life. Her uprising marked both the height and the end of large-scale native resistance. In the following decades, Roman rule spread across most of the island. They built cities, Londinium, Camulodunum, Eboracum, and roads that still trace the British landscape today. Stone replaced timber, Latin joined the native tongues, and temples rose where once had stood sacred groves. But Rome never conquered everything. The far north, the wild lands of Caledonia, now Scotland, remained untamed. In the year 122, Emperor Hadrian ordered a wall built to mark the northern limit of empire. Stretching 73 miles from sea to sea, Hadrian's wall was both barrier and statement. It divided not only land but identity. To the south, Roman Britain. To the north, the unconquered. Life under Rome was a paradox. For some, it brought peace, trade and prosperity. Roads linked towns, markets flourished, and urban life, with its baths, forums and villas, took root even in this far province. Roman Britain produced grain, metal and wool for the empire, becoming a vital economic hub. For others, it meant taxes, conscription, and cultural erasure. The old ways, the Druids, the rituals of land and fire, were suppressed. The Romans, fearful of rebellion and superstition, targeted the Druids specifically. According to Tacitus, Roman forces slaughtered them on the island of Anglesey, where they had made their last stand among the sacred groves. With their deaths, something ancient in Britain's soul was silenced. But even in assimilation, the island remained distinct. Romanisation was never complete. Outside the walled towns in rural Britain, life carried on much as it always had. Farmers still ploughed their fields, spoke their native tongues, and honoured their old gods, often blending them with Roman ones. Shrines to local deities merged with those to Jupiter or Mars. A temple inscription might invoke both a Roman and a river god in the same breath. Evidence not of conquest, but of coexistence. By the 3rd century, cracks began to show. The empire was overstretched and fracturing. Roman troops were recalled to fight wars closer to home. Raiders from the north and from across the sea tested the island's defences. The province of Britannia, once Rome's pride, became a burden. In the early 5th century, the last legions were withdrawn, leaving behind towns, roads, and a generation of people who were Roman in law, but Celtic in blood and spirit. When the imperial banners disappeared over the horizon, Britain was not conquered again for several generations, but neither was it united. The hillforts, the villages, the temples, and the roads all remained, layered atop each other like fossils of human intention. The island that had once stood at the edge of the prehistoric world was now at the edge of history, and that, perhaps, is the most poetic ending of all. Every island begins as a continent, a place connected, full of life and promise, and ends as a memory, eroded by time and tide. Britain began as part of a great landmass, then became a world of its own, shaped by ice, fire, and will. By the time Rome left, it was no longer prehistoric. It was something new, a crossroads of cultures, a mirror of empires, a memory still being written. And when we walk the fields today, or follow the curve of Hadrian's wall, we are not just walking through ruins. We're walking through the layers of everything that made us.